time to be human right now.
I know. You're debating and stuff. No,
Yeah.
I need it for
Not.
How many girls do you have? A lot.
I'm good to go.
Yeah, 100% now.
Alright, cool. Status quo healthcare science have the social economic conditions of great disparities in health promoting population rate policy effectively need to move beyond the provision of medical care move towards a goal of improving health for each population, land children, small contemporary social connected medical health problems. As a primary solution of medical care policy which focus on access to services and policies of the population of vulnerable to a person's neglected key social and economic causes of health vulnerability and disparities among the critical to improving health lack of access here with the fundamental cause of health vulnerability, social understanding and policy results to be effectively used to moving on the provision of medical care policy to focus on care aspiring positive overarching goal of improving health status of displaced by more media goal of increasing access to healthcare services and sufficient policies to make social economic conditions rise to vulnerability in the first place. U.S. experience is high social disparity reflected in policy initiatives to access healthcare as a whole. Response 16 of the U.S. is not the police based on the practical history of how it's been dying in regions of your nation that also diminishes along with social growth. These experiences of current high rates of racial and health disparities within the U.S. Despite that, work health research like behind the international research efforts focus on social economic determinants and on the U.S. health profession becomes increasingly myopic focus on individuals' healthcare rather than the health training. Not just through sustainable change in healthcare trends and about transdisciplinary approaches examining the multi-layered contributions to political, social, determinants, health inequality. Healthcare reform discourses set around an assumption of excessive demand, intrinsic scarcity creates a neoliberal understanding of care and health, limiting the ability for reform only by expanding our understanding of healthcare to examine all spaces where care is produced and consumed. Can we provide to reform the late set of public healthcare reform the United States should not have any issues with the principles or simply the idea that the provision of healthcare needs to be more fully subjected to disciplinary logic free market exchange of state care for access to arise the right to care and by the state or commodity. This debate has been continuously restaged without being resolved. The answer suggests that both sides share a common understanding of what healthcare is and motivation of care providers. These racial assumptions and the rights possibility of healthcare from healthcare assumptions that to be expert knowledge and extensive equipment. Patients are seen as consumers who will demand as much care as possible to overall effect of these initial assumptions create an economy of care governed by excessive demand, intrinsic scarcity from this perspective. The choice of government versus market allocation of care because the choice of how we prefer to impose limit scarcity is conceived of healthcare reform being seen as partial effects of impoverished conception of what care is like expanding our imagination of care is important implication how we conceive healthcare reform government administered national health insurance policy only be one step to reform the examination of space where care is produced, the conditions produced, how it is consumed, absent an assessment of the informal caregiving sector. Debates about generic healthcare policy rules of rational scarcity of care and ensure past and future reformation efforts fail to heal and aid the implementation of government programs will provide access to care for the local population where there is partisan debate about how to hold health in the U.S. and continue to move towards a misallocation, creating a perfect alignment for each side to blame the other for the present shortcomings in the system. What is that? That gives the debate and the stage to impasse of the problems, costs, and that seen as a function of patient and provider's rational self-interest. Government and ministers have adopted a system of capitated payment settlement. Hospitals' position the fundamental problem will always be constraining patient demand and controlling costs of constraining demand and controlling costs of only logical responses to the excessive demand of patients and providers. The choice between healthcare as a right or quality is reduced explicit rationing by the state of the market, reinforced by data care. There is no one care essential assumption by patients themselves. Those scarcity is adopting condition the ontological status of patient and providers. The rational utility maximizes the truth. The demands will always be needed to constrain and control. There will always be healthcare reform and it will always fail. An exploration of the informal sector by allowing a different approach to healthcare reform. Informal caregivers cannot be understood through the lens of demand inducement, accepting the informal caregiving sector might allow us to see unrecognized resources by supplies with alternative conceptualization of caregiving, such as now refusal to acknowledge shared vulnerability grounds, violent military interventions, disavowing dependence and weakness generates insidious forms of political governmentality in the name of security. 16. Vulnerabilities that always assign great value to recognition constitute vulnerability to episodic foundation for the understanding about inequalities and anecdote of fear, vulnerability, vulnerabilities have specifically target invulnerability, masculine ideologies, about weakness, defense, and hence to achieve invulnerability and indicating the aftermath of 9/11 new layers of securitization justify the expansion by political governmentality domestically and military interventions abroad. Invulnerability reforms oppressive economic and social interventions for help refugees support other free thinking. Vulnerability seems necessary to potential provide great conceptual tools of practical conundrums scholars have been to elaborate the topic of technology constitute vulnerability to address concrete injustices is epitomized in the logic of risk health insurance services and technology of risk management to externalize uncertainty towards the future into an actuarial calculus engagement with the welfare state. Just reinvest in this logic about 13. The discourse participants in the future into calculative relation to the present dystopias, finding your insurance premiums have lapsed trenchable risk. Futures unthinkable within the discourse versus operates legitimation of the existing system. The welfare state is not consequences by essential all systems of insurance manufacturer uncertainty is confronted with the fringe action organized and reflects the way insurance is a way of helping people. And that way of helping create that perception consequences are unavoidable. What happens to suffer the negative consequence of ill health or unemployment is accident subject only to the laws of chance, such as chance of meeting when the claims equal to the risk of external to the system of insurance. There's no need to argue that there's external to society itself produced by individual behavior process consequence of elimination of the community has been part of the death of the social there. Then I think that things are getting worse and there's no clear way out. Utopia becomes a warding off of danger. The chicken line class society of regulation hazards, and measures that have been unleashed and extended previously unknowing the central political issues, becoming the reduction of legitimation of inequality. Thus stand, and I affirm orienting national health insurance policies and discussions around an ethic of care, and an ethic of care that reimagines the discourse surrounding scarcity of care, opens up space for discussions about a politics of possibility of universal and comprehensive care, which truly addresses healthcare reform and healing and sex. Enacting a new policy of healthcare reform requires a reconceptualization of economy present discourses fixated allocation in the face of certain scarcity. Universal healthcare will only make things worse. What if there is source potential work of care really important? We do not appreciate because how we think about the economy replaces scarcity basis and discourse of development of a new economic ontology of the economy itself as the process of producing, distributing, and consuming goods and services. Then economic activity takes place in households and other communities, locations that will improve. The point is not simply rather render the healthcare economy visible, rather first and towards an alternative politics of healthcare reform, situating healthcare as a diverse economy changes. The object of reforming is no longer a question of how to pay, but how we rearrange the paid and unpaid elements of the care economy to meet needs rather than a politics of scarcity. The diverse economy allows us to imagine healthcare reform and relation, connection, possibility, and articulation. There is no trade-off between political project and critical theory. I best voting affirmative, reinvigorates new policy making, bringing around in terms of absolute decision, places us in a position of false identity that God's criticality maintains the status quo. This brown and five critical theories, application for physics, extension. There's always a choice to be made in the political reality, implementation of choice themselves material. Critical theory comes back to politics offering a different sense of times and of time. Immediate choices are just that, and often last no longer than political season. It's difficult to name a single instance in which critical theory is killed off a political project. At worst, it must give them a bad consciousness for news or imagination to reach a bigger critic. This is not a firm possibility in the present and future, while no possibility not making a bid for political power. It's not being critiques and clear what is to be done. But critical theories, political theory cannot get off the block without affirming contestable and Christian values that are themselves affirmations. This world then this time to change the way government perceives healthcare. We need to shift our moral focus and care and decision making, incorporating responsibility and intent, examining the failures of the past and their source could remedy future political barriers. Robinson, the 97, the ethic of care is a practice of developing finding future particular content, specifically care, and to focus on 3 minutes and then elements of attendance, responsibility, responsiveness, practice, focus on moral situations arising out of relationships. It must listen and learn from real individuals. It is a practical morality that is an agency and action. It takes responsibilities as primary moral value of men. Action requires recognition of responsibilities rather than indeterminate pictures. Agency and ethic of care is necessary to address implementation, reformation, failures, and policy proposals. Robin 10. Problems that the implementation makes less likely objectively achieved. Implementation critical to success in healthcare policy failure. Anticipated the implementation problems with policy reforms being actively linked to failure and achieved programmatic objectives. Costly for backlash potential. Implementation problems rarely receive sustained, systemic, and detailed and visible attention. Affirming an ethic of care is an inherently political idea. What's debated and within debate is key to addressing major issues that exist in political structures. With the U.S. installed in 95 political strategy, regional more Madison, new terms reform, political debate change the status of care to understand care as a political idea. Toronto armies of care provides us with a political strategy. Change care as a political value can transform public discussion. Toronto's analysis and energy need to locate the care and work within political structures in the United States with feminist knowledge production needs to challenge the legitimacy of conventional thought and policymaker refrain. The current moral political debate is urgent. Now, liberal ideology masks the constellation of care work integral to politics and social institutions. The ethic of care reveals how human security is more central to discussions and existential conflicts that currently dominate policy discourse. Robinson 11 behind every individual's constellation of care that works collectively to ensure life, security, well-being, constellation, private care, variety of factors, institutional and look forward to the political liberalism, constellation, to the point there's rarely even a need to consider the sources and resources of care that offers less than this support on a daily basis for millions exploitative arrangements governing receiving care from the basic human security on a daily basis rather than an optional extra care forms to be a very basic morality in which other moral concepts are supported. Members of demonstrating the importance of care to any institution politics illustrates the necessity of locating the ethic of care within the notion of citizenship of the states of care, respecting their expertise and moral considerations, public debates, and care are central to the field of international relations. Number one is the highest point of high politics, security, traditional realism, and the concept of focus only exclusive and state security. Security, there's understood purely in terms of conflict. Now, individual constitutes primary security reference created to define the care secondary concern. However, care is not considered something only required of people who are hurt, weak, or vulnerable. Rather, which the care is the basis of all social life. And the affirmative can't solve every problem. Nothing can. We must accept the discomfort outside of actuarial logic to move towards an ethic of care. Grant 11. Actuarial rationality is the only evidence of pervasive device categorization and views. Logic and it becomes invisible data marks of actuarial thinking propelled. No biologic, naturality, naturalization versus insurance, invisibility, actuarial, that has pursuit of alternative, non-actuarial ways of thinking, measuring the movement, things that uncomfortable with our actuarial stage. Good discomfort is the first step, the best route towards not being governed.
Cool. You ready for cross-sects?
Yep.
Sweet. So your Walters evidence says that access is key, and your Lance evidence says concerted policy action is critical to improve health. Those are key determinants. Policy is key to remedy those things. How's the after material result in people having increased access to healthcare?
Absolutely. We defend community care. Like we say that focus on healthcare reform should start through communities and an analysis of social relationships that create health inequalities
Okay,
and
so
disparities.
care could be provided at the community level. Is this like, are you going to build clinics? How does
Sure, it can be. Absolutely.
Okay. So the F builds out clinics. Taking a position in insurance is a bad thing. It says actuarial logic. Does the F provide insurance to anyone, or is it just provide?
No,
free
we're
care?
saying the logic of insurance is bad. We think things like mutual aid societies can be like a physical manifestation of an alternative to insurance, but we also think
Okay.
ethic of care is more
So
than
the F
just a
develops-
funding mechanism.
The F develops a mutual aid societies and builds out clinics. People can get free care.
What?
The F builds out mutual aid societies and clinics so people can get access to care. Correct?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. I want to talk about the advocacy statement now,
Yeah.
specifically the word orienting. What is orienting NHI policy discussions around ethic of care and care?
Sure. So we think that current political discussions of healthcare reform have stagnated around mechanisms for constraining costs in the face of certain scarcity of resources. We're saying
Okay.
that logic of understanding
Sure.
healthcare is a
That's the
limited
actuarial
resource is
argument.
bad. No, that's actually the Healy piece of evidence. Actuarial logic is risk calculus. This is different.
Okay, so it's like the scarcity is a bad argument rather than the actual bad argument.
And also the concept of like an unlimited demand for biomedical treatment, we're critiquing that notion. We're saying that it's not necessary to constrain
Yeah.
costs in that way, and that's the
I
only.
want to ask,
Sure.
like, why you're not just replicating risk logic by being like, hey, we don't have to be responsible for all of the AF as long as we address some percentage of.
I don't know what that
market
means.
X.
I
You're
don't
like,
think
we'll
that's
never be
what-
perfect, but as long as we solve like
No, that's the.
coverage
oh, okay,
70%,
I understand.
that sounds like something
Sure,
an
so
actuary would
that's
say.
a complete rejection of risk logic, obviously, because we're saying that we need to step outside of these notions of like predictability. We say the entire logic of insurance is say that we can invest in certain bodies because we will like receive a benefit from that, or like in the long
Okay.
term. It's making bets based on
Yeah, no,
people's
I
bodies. We're
get
saying that
you.
that's a bad thing. So we're rejecting
I have
that
a-
by saying insurance is bad.
I have a question about the ethic of care part. The only time your 1AC defines this in evidence is where your Robinson evidence just says the
Yeah.
ethic of care is a practice. What practice is that? How do we orient ourselves toward that
Yeah.
ethic?
Sure, so I think one, it does define it, it says it has three tenets: responsiveness, responsibility, and attentiveness. And so all of the Healy evidence is written in context to that definition, because the entire dissertation is about orienting discussions of health insurance or health care around that logic.
Okay, you said it's responsiveness,
Attentiveness and responsibility.
responsiveness, and what were the other two?
Attentiveness and responsibility.
Okay, cool.
I need a couple of seconds.
That's fine. We'll take the more credit.
I need an echo.
You want those super tall? Yes.
All right, so
Okay, 9:30 left.
it's gonna be 4 in this case. It's nice and tall for me.
Yes, it is.
So much better than speaking from a garbage can.
Wow, that's very
I just like it this way.
Carter is very tall.
And you know it's literally inches long. What it passes on this one. I got it, I'm just making it now. And it wasn't for everyone, so you should have one second. Yeah, I'm just gonna double it, yeah. Oh, never mind. Oh, yeah. You know, okay. Oh, yeah.
What is the control shift?
Control shift piece.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you all ready?
Sorry, she's just pulling up the doc with the internet's just being really
Any
slow.
problems?
Oh, yeah. We talked about this.
Yeah, we weren't on the internet Got it? Alright. First is topicality. The affirmative has to defend that a comprehensive national plan that finances and provides access to the health care in the United States should be established. Malton. Canadian National Health Insurance is a comprehensive national plan for provision and payment of health care, ensuring all persons have access to medical care. And federal government means the government of the United States of America. Valentine's in 95, the government of the United States of America. And established means to institute as law and bring into existence Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of Law. 96 to institute as a law permanently by enactment or agreement and to bring into existence. They don't defend that an NHI system should be established. He is distinct from framework or in terms is agnostic about the means of absolvency, so long as an endpoint is an advocated policy. It's their burden to prove specifically between their offense and our vision for debate. Procedure must be prior to substance. No team has their right to an ideal world. Holding debate to some boundary checks apps that either say nothing in the 1AC in order to impact term framework or endorse an uncontestable goal. That makes debate structurally unfair because it erodes the burden of rejoinder, and judges will always grant some risk to the app's content. Our interrupt solves argumentative skills. Time well teams to the topic forces ideas to be defended in high-stakes situations under imperfect conditions. Debate is uniquely geared to train people in argument making. Unlike other activities, it's vital to obey a personal and professional advocacy in any facet of life. Talking about health insurance matters, and learning how to be knowledgeable, persuasive advocates can improve our insurance choices, doctor-patient interactions, etc. Topicality is a voting issue, and competing interpretations is the best standard of evaluation. To state the point of clash is crucial to productive debates, and limits is the most objective measure of stability. Second off is also topicality. National health insurance means topical apps are limited to only government-funded healthcare administration. Provision of care by the government or all payer systems are distinct. Dornick 16, there are three types of national health insurance and national health service where three types of health insurance programs. National health service, where medical services are delivered by government salaried physicians and clinics, publicly owned and operated, financed by governments through tax payments, NHI, or single payer, in which a government acts as an administrator to collect all fees and pay out cost. Medical services are publicly financed but not publicly provided. All payer provides universal insurance via sickness funds, eliminating administrative costs for billing. The health insurance is distinct from healthcare. Mitchell in 14. Health insurance is not healthcare. Health insurance is a financial mechanism for paying for healthcare. It's not the care itself or even a guarantee of care. And voting for precision and limits. There's far too many mechanisms for government to eliminate private medicine and provide for care which spikes out of the best net counterplans and case defense. Skewing debates toward the app prefer a definition because it has the intent to define different mechanisms for healthcare provision. Topicality is a voting issue. Cross by the voter from the other page. Third off is the dissent. Economic growth is strong fundamentals and relaxed regulation dominant 18. The economy has done something that's been unable to do since 2005. 3% growth for 3/4 in our consumer spending. The labor market was a strong improvement in business attitudes and spending as a direct result of the changing of the guard in Washington, contributing and more consistent growth business and investment was lagging, but that has a lot to do with the attitude about regulation. Growth was 3.2 in the third quarter and 3.1 in the second quarter. It was the strongest we've seen. Expansion is being driven by all key components, and expanding insurance coverage requires massive tax hikes. Headley's earned in 17 particular hikes. The ACA are most expensive and obstacle to universal coverage is high cost. The key question is how to paying for costly patients who require substantial infusions of funds. Cost proved unsustainable. 27% of conditions that would likely leave them uninsurable. Pre-ACA federal funding is essential. $25 billion is insufficient. Coverage is funded by general taxation. Universal coverage for patients with highest costs require massive government spending that wrecks the economy. Hit or miss. Intent tax cycle will change a long-standing policy driven by understanding the lower tax rates. Support growth increases have serious consequences. Sharply lower growth, the GDP would fall. Fewer jobs, more unemployed loss. Consumer spending, economic harm is significant and widespread, and economic decline causes a big scary war. Ban in 14. Economic considerations figure into the calculus for future conflict security issues with economic underpinnings. Translate classical determinants of conflict and change the manner in which rival states will engage in hostile acts. Economic uncertainty provide developing states with asymmetric options for balancing. Stronger states are likely to mature into global threats. Declining reduced military spending by the U.S. with allied affect allied confidence, cause regional instability or realignments in Asia. Rival states becoming bold that challenge America. Fourth off is the critique. The plan operates through a double discourse of care, expressing intent to provide care to the marginalized while holding the conditions that make indigenous people sick. Darasso in 6. Double discourse expressing interest in the provision of care while making people of color sick while the indigenous resistance by turning into colonial structures and integral arm of invasion grants were given to doctors who settle areas and develop medical institutions makes colonial interest palatable. This subjugates women of color by negating indigenous knowledge is healing from women in indigenous communities is displaced invasion creates needs for medical intervention. The MIC determines who is treated, who lives and who dies, even if treatment is provided. Violence persists. Care is still rife with racism, classism, sexism. The sick role has been assigned to marginalized communities and implies deviance. Medicine's professional and Eurocentric shroud grants the authority to define sickness, name the sick, and identify the healthy. The app's strategic silence should be read as a narrative of settlement. The refusal of the app to question colonialism reproduces knowledge which defines the native as already or inevitably gone, therefore erasing them. Organs in attempt. Normative functions of settlement is to appear inevitable and final. Scholars have theorized settler colonialism with the social processes and narratives that displace native people while granted settlers belonging to the native land. This displacement is enabled by settler narratives of native absence of experience while produce forms of knowledge about native people as already or inevitably gone. The very absence of native people in the stories telling about qualities of settler subject cultures and social life. And settlement is not an event but a structuring ontological logic of elimination constantly manifesting in everyday reiteration of the very modes of spatial inhabitants and subjective modes of being. This should affect how you read the spatial metaphor of their plan text. Rifkin in 14. Attempts to theorize settler colonialism shift attention from its effects to its implications for non-native political attachments, inhabitants, and being tracking the pervasive dominant operation as a structure, not an event, logical elimination drives settler sociality. Native repressed continues to structure settler colonial society. The structure of subjective possession occurs through imposition on one's will to be on the thing that is perceived delightful, thus open to being possessed. The ontological structure of white subjectivity has been conflated in ways that misdirect and cloud attention. The alternative is a disidentification with the affirmative in favor of a queer color critique. Through disidentification, two-spirit critiques emerge that centralize native people and decolonization movements that can eradicate colonial violence. There is no permutation, risk, or intent. Disidentification is a hermeneutical performance of decoding from the perspective of minority subject to its dispattern in a representational hierarchy, critically revision, nationalist struggles, right? A center of resistance to spirit people position identities as productive to decolonial agendas, not an assimilation movement against colonial powers that dominate sovereignty. Two-spirit critiques push to a more complex analysis, incorporating critiques of hetero-patriarchal nationalism, unseen perpetuates an national narrative in which native people are raised homelands aren't seen as occupied native. People must disidentify to make them viable for our communities. Through disidentification, the other critiques emerge that centralized native identities create more robust and effective intervention. Lines can interrupt unseen by consciously positioning our work to open space for existing stories that run counter to the imperial desires of scholarship. Case 1E.C. Walters identifies that access to health care is crucial and that we have to overcome scarcity in care. The AF doesn't fiat a system that provides universal access or overcome scarcity. Vote negative on presumption. Financialized health insurance not only constitutes networks of care but mediates the distribution of expectant affect. Private insurance promises security to those with adequate coverage and dread to the un and underinsured. There is no single logic of health insurance, and the foreclosing social solidarity built through it is bad. Down on Mulligan in 16. In crisis, insurance comes to offer solace and material comfort. Misfortune when claims to deny health insurance is to be more visible illness too often results in financial catastrophe. Philosophical and political themes have been hotly debated in abstract terms. We push to critically examine health insurance and practice insurance constitute networks for care, managed care, change the moral economy of care, a counter narrative to raise market-based medicine. Debates about how to finance care raise questions. Will health insurance be a vehicle for provision of social protections and generalized reciprocity, or promote individual responsibility at the expense of social solidarity? Social insurance programs, e.g. Medicare in Canada, are organized according to principles of solidarity. Financing may shift citizens' relationship to the state, increasing financialization, create disparities in inaccessible care. Insurance also has the potential to open avenues for marginalized care. Counter to the U.S. insurance is being introduced to collectivized care. Insurance does not have a single logic. A healthcare workforce, sustainable financing, and transformation to social norms around care seeking may be immediate challenges. Covered services should be broad. Cost sharing, low risk pools should be broad and deep to promote social solidarity and lasting commitment to true universal coverage. And P1AC isolates community health clinics as a solution. Those fail. They lack financial resources. People are unaware of their existence, and bureaucracy holds them back to whereas at all in 17. Community health workers, marginalization, and mental health workforce affects their ability to address health equity. This seems stems from multiple factors. CHWs generally occupy less economically powerful positions at peripheral social locations where CHWs and their clients tend to be poor and face barriers to racism, gender inequities, discrimination. CHWs workforce may be invisible and undervalued. Invisibility results in systematic inequity and health across populations, which hinders their ability to address health equity. CHWs has less funding responsiveness to community concerns may be concerned by bureaucracy, which may stifle or delay new initiatives, and community-oriented solutions are insufficient to solve widespread material suffering. We need to organize demands for universal health care. 4th and 7th. Find me another concept. To be successful movements have to imbue participants with a deep sense of personal and collective responsibility. Let's explore the limits articulated with, never mind. Demands for the Congressional Black Caucus all were positioned within many generations of African Americans who would coalesce to establish single payer. None of these righteous demands can be accomplished by some deluded narrow self-help. Churches do operate prison ministries, but that cannot dismantle an intake mechanism. The current community cannot be addressed absent the spending of many tens of billions of dollars. And self-help must come from mass political action. Entrepreneurship does not significantly alter relations of power in a world ruled by MNC community-funded planning, state thousands of lives, but none of our solutions like mortality rates. The universal health care must be one in a struggle with for-profit corporations. Can I read this last part, Spencer?
Yeah.
Their disavowal of the material limits to carrying capacities disavows the real threat of social reproductive scarcity, aligning with a neoliberal logic that authorizes endless consumption. You should refuse their call to make the informal care sector intelligible, which merely opens it up as a new frontier for extraction. Leonard and Fraser at 16. It's assumed there will always be significant sufficient energy to sustain social connections in which society depends similar to the way that nature is treating capitalist societies as an infinite reservoir from which we can make it take as much as we want and into which we can dump any amount of waste. Both can be structured to a break equipment society withdraws public support and conservative providers in the logic ruling market depletes. Market depletes. Yeah.
My first question is, what is the meaningful distinction between this framework and T argument? I don't really understand that.
Well, the first is that you should defend a federal government policy. The second is argument about which policy you should defend.
So, but that card also indicates that it's the federal government. So, so one of them is just federal government, and one of them is federal government plus insurance.
We might go for a less stringent interpretation of what it means to be topical, but we could also go for a more demanding interpretation, which says not only do you have to be USFG, but you have to be NHI.
Okay, that makes sense. So I'm going to go on to the cis ad that you read, so the dominant 18B7 indicates that, like, as a result of things like tax cuts and Trump being in office, that we've seen economic growth. Why should we prioritize that or put that in opposition to people getting coverage for like chronic conditions, which is what your internal like P7
Well, one,
speaks to? Why should we put those two things in opposition?
I think that maintaining growth is a crucial prerequisite to ensuring a lot of people have access to health.
Why is that true when like growth since 2008 has happened, but it's only benefited like the top 5% of people? Why should we care about that more than people getting access to
We're not
care?
saying growth is good. Obviously,
You
there are
said
problems
growth is
with the
good. Your
status
evidence
quo.
says
We
that,
think
so I'm
fast.
asking for who?
We think recession is bad. We think recession means that even those 5% of
Okay.
people who have access to care as a result of growth
Sure.
will lose it.
So your Hertzlinger piece of evidence talks about how the ACA is already incredibly expensive, that universal coverage could lead to increased government expenditure. It doesn't say that would necessarily come from tax hikes, so how can you say that all forms of universal coverage would go hand in hand with tax hikes? Because that's what your other internal piece of evidence is predicated on.
Well, that's fine. If you
That's not
specify
that.
a different funding mechanism, then we'll either say that was cheating or we'll read it
This
differently. We
evidence
think
does say that that funding happens through taxation. Coverage is
It
primarily
does not
funded by
say that,
general
it just
taxation.
says the expansion of government expenditure.
No, the highlighted line says coverage is funded by general taxation.
Yeah, that's exactly
No,
how premium
Oh.
subsidies are funded under the ACA, so maybe that's like a normal means
Okay,
argument.
that's fair, okay. So, let's talk about the first piece of link evidence. Is this just a criticism of the expansion of biomedicine? Like that, like focus on biomedicine being bad and exclusionary?
Well, you're obviously going to be like, we think medicalization is bad too, but
No, I'm just asking you.
our argument is that you sort of obscure that it's not that medicalization is a result of naive but well-meaning policymakers who don't understand real health problems. It is,
Is that it's
maintain-
weaponized against?
yeah, it is literally a tool to legitimize settlement.
Okay, and then erasing the native, is this just an omission argument?
It's a strategic silence argument. I don't know if that's really different, but.
We'll see.
We'll start from, okay. I'm gonna just filling up the starts now.
Okay.
Okay, start from.
Sorry, what was it?
8 minutes.
Okay.
Like this.
Thank you. Is everybody ready for an order?
Yep.
Okay, it's gonna be case, the econ staff, the sellers okay. The first T argument, which is the government one, and then the second T argument, the NHI one. Okay. Cool. Did everyone pull up the doc? Okay. Casey, you can do 2, 1, 2, 2. Current government intervention in healthcare naturalizes social disparities by focusing on a medical hospital illness. This kind of politics doesn't resolve underlying assumptions from the overgrowth calculus that necessitates biomedical intervention in the first place. It's our lens evidence is actuarial rationality is premise of the ability to calculate the value of human life that distances people from their own vulnerability and the care that they will inevitably give and receive because of the imbalance in power relationship. Now, without this recognition of inherent vulnerability, cost-benefit ideology securitizes people and places justifying valuing lives over others and provides a rationale for violent military intervention and biopolitical expansion. That's our goal. Evidence is a conceded impact coming out of the 1NC of affirmative souls because it refocuses moral political discussions around this kind of vulnerability. Our praxis uses attentiveness, responsibility, and responsiveness to ground vulnerability in our relationship to the world, which answers other presumption arguments. Most of the arguments they make on the bottom of the flow. Now, health insurance doesn't have a science definition. We think that NHI is symbolic of the fact that everyone should receive health care, but focusing on how a normative form of U.S. insurance can resolve these disparities is problematic. Again, erases of vulnerability, which means that even if they go for a TPA, it's never going to be able to solve the act. They'll do more of that debate on the T-flow. Now, they say their risk calculation argument, they say financing is good, but the history of risk pooling means that it's a constant process of devaluation. Actuarial logic gets racist and should be rejected in every instance. Will persist. A statistician published an article on how Black Americans were uninsurable in response to state legislation banning discrimination against African Americans. Hoffman was a strong proponent of racial hierarchy and white supremacy. His application of math to social and debate set a precedent for using actuarial science, which absorbed bias and errors from other participants. Hoffman's work embedded a racial ideology within actuarial data, a legitimate legacy that remains in the field today. Scientists who give racism respectability were first-rate scientists. Social and political use of statistical data obscures wider understanding is important to health, and they say that when ACA care fails either, it means that there's no link to the DISAD because there's no way to get enough financing, or they aren't able to go for the DISAD in the first place. Now they can't win the merits of this argument because our helio-8 evidence indicates that debates about who is paying for what is stagnated in the status quo, which means that calculations of who is able to make enough money or pay for care is always going to be biased in the wrong direction and lead to zero policy failure. So our affirmative is key to shifting away from that type of knowledge production by using a radical political imagination oriented around an ethic of care. Now, all other arguments that they're making is answered by the overview of presumption arguments that I made about now. You can go to the econ dissent. Care and vulnerability is integral to better understandings of IR and calculations around evidence and negatives. Realist view forefronts conflict and ignores constellations of care that ensure lives aren't devalued in the first place. Otherwise, it leads to endless wars that just resurface themselves elsewhere. And Utah only benefits the majority and results in violence. So double fork. Utah makes a mockery of justice outside of the interest of the majority, while authority in the interest of minority segment of the population. The Utah commitment to maximize good due to the failure to take seriously the distinction between person and person. Is forced to give him too much to ensure the max satisfaction in this case for the asset form is chosen to be sacrificed for the group, and translating economic issues into existential crises is a legitimizing tactic that papers over disenfranchised population and towards the dissent because it means that their economic calculations are always going to be wrong. Stealing 14. Narratives of crisis invoke existential threats about production of money, straws and challenges of competitive economy. Aspects of economic life are increasingly interpreted as problems of national security. The discussion of constructing economic viability is an issue of national security. The application of the metaphor of war deployed within the concepts of national economy is engaged in the unending global concepts of challenge of neoliberal globalization is constructed as a crisis of economic competition. National viability can be used to justify inequalities. Neoliberalism institutes danger proves the conditions have enhanced legitimacy of the state ballot and those empowered, those experts able to formulate, implement, and assess solutions to the discourse of prices, risk required, and go to the settlers in K. There's no link, we don't endorse medicalization. You shouldn't vote on the link of omission either. Now, perm use a disidentification as a way to examine the counties of care in and outside the formal economy. The starts with an examination of the spaces where care is produced and consumed. This is key to solve the affirmative, but also overcomes the problems with just the alternative care. It stands zero sum in the status quo with patients and the consumers that have excessive demands. With the affirmative reimagines care outside of that economy of scarcity with one ACR. A community focus means that a disidentification is accessible to people, but doesn't over-prescribe. That is the only solution, which means that the permutation is key to solve. Now, there's a community disidentification doesn't allow for a nuanced discussion of responsibility and can't access the specific strategies that different communities use, especially because disidentification obscures the difference between the colonizer and the colonized, which means that that universal solution is impacted because it recreates psychological violence without acknowledging that different communities use different strategies to deal with depression. Those communities will be unfairly blamed for their own suffering, which turns all of their links and now indigenous groups have used an ethic of care and environmental movements to protect their relationship to community and lands. They can't win an exclusion or non-accessibility link, but also proves the viability of the permutation might be most succeed. Indigenous people have that attentive to caring on intertwined needs of human and non-human communities, concepts of care and integral aspects of human communities and practices of indigenous focus and meaning different from the traditions of care ethics articulated by people, the cultures and heritage, philosophical and practical themes are related to care ethics influential many indigenous environmental discourses and indigenous conceptions of care emphasize awareness, moral connection, interdependence, responsibility, and restore people and communities who are wounded. Now go to the first T argument. We beat NHI, we endorse universal and comprehensive care. That's a distinct shift. We beat insurance, not the community national health insurance policy, because health systems are constituted by social infrastructures and constellation of care. Often 17. Much national discussion in the U.S. gives real health care really focused on medical services and ability to get screened, treatment services, so while finding little to do with health care, there's talking about insurance, access to health care, so right of medical services. Health is not part of medical services, a really lucrative field like care. Health has been monopolized when people talk about rapidly changing health care systems. They're really talking about the social infrastructure and the personal interactions that make up health. Now, the only functional difference between the negative and the affirmative interpretation is the state's counterplan shitty politics. This as a government process, counterplan ground will impact her that education argumentation style with the expediency. Deciding to cross-apply the Brown evidence with the 1AC there. Use of debate to create immediate policy solutions to ongoing problem trade-off with other radical reformation efforts and political imagination. Helioate says that specific debates are key to moving away from these type of bureaucratic solutions and create a new politics that addresses the failed reformation efforts. Otherwise, they are always going to lead to zero policy failure because it can never be introspective. Now, our counter-interpretation that debates should be about people in the United States receiving universal and comprehensive care. You can prefer reasonability over competing interpretation because we are in the direction of the topic and we still provide states they can prepare for universal care, which means that they get all of their links to DISAD's counterplans and case. Now, topicality isn't a procedural, it's a tool of exclusion that relegates minoritized bodies and different forms of knowledge production fungible. Put in the context of healthcare, Healy indicates that framing T as an ethical orientation and investment instead and only reinvest in stagnated debates over discussion about who pays for what, which turns off their argumentation and education standards. Now, debate is a question of ethical subject formation, so even if they win this game, the reason why we play the game is to learn means that if we win any claim that their limits leads to a bad education, then you vote affirmative, even if we're handedly losing the fairness debate. Now, our affirmative is specifically good for debate policymakers use value framing and not data to make decisions and create policy. Only the affirmative speaks of value formation. It gives debaters the analytical skills to persuade people and change their policy goals. Ethics is a D rule. It comes before evaluating team persona. The policy process includes ideas from which inform policy conception. Policymakers use knowledge of evidence to justify choices which are based on value judgment, persuasion of the key, not accuracy or data. The language of competitiveness and the language of business community critical to understand the power of the discourse and exploring the role of influence and ideas and policy leads. You should prefer this because it's more real world. Now, there's no T version of the aptly impact or inclusion of insurance-based mechanisms in debate. Now, you can go to the second T argument and cross-apply all the counterplan and repeat arguments because it's going to be the same arguments. They're going to collapse it in the block. Now, you have these 100 debates on insurance. This is the actuarialism to set to their education and an independent reason about affirmative with the terminal impact turns their education. It promotes a risk-based economic future orientation that creates a drive for self-security and obscures constellation of care by excluding them from debates completely, which turns off their argumentation and education standards, which are the only standards in the 1AC at the moment. So you should give them 1AR leniency on answering the other standards that they're going to put in the block. Now, on a larger scale, actuarial calculation logic produces the rationality of mass extermination and population nuclear war. There is a specific connection between insurance actuarialism and the militarized violently forced debates to center on Part 11. Activists in the U.S. were promotions and practitioners of actuarial thinking, pioneer of social application of statistics and means of solving social problems, progressive appetite for surveillance Healthcare is often the most obvious example of actual irrationality attempts to segregate off risk to the population that occurred in military strategy. Actuarialism was also rampant regions seeking offer construction by atomic weapons cost benefit analysis drug these systems. You can also cross-apply the wolf evidence to prove the top penalties about ethical subject formation, that you always reject that T argument. Can I have just... Oh, yeah.
So how do you determine that marginalized communities receive worse health care without using statistical methods?
I think that that's constituted by community, understandings of their own social disparities. I don't know how you can
Right, so you're
plug into an equation the value of what it's like to live
I'm
next to a
asking-
coal ash plant
No.
and have your lungs literally be
Okay.
destroyed and not get medicine for it.
I'm-
There's no value you can put on that.
I'm asking how you know that people living next to coal plants have worse health than other
Are you
populations
fucking
without
kidding?
using
Because they have
statistics.
black lung.
And-
But you don't need an equation to know that you're not
But then how
healthy
can
or
you
you're not
measure that
getting
other
access
people
to
don't
health.
have black lung, right?
I don't think the argument is
You-
statistics bad. It's
Oh,
the
okay.
way it's
So it's not
what-
statistics,
It's
okay.
not the
It's the way
literal
that
math,
you
it's
calculate
the
risk
deploy.
within statistics
okay.
to use it as a method for a social apparatus of understanding what those people go through.
You have
Which-
a totalizing claim about actuarial logics being bad. Actuarial value is a calculation of how much of a person's care needs are met by an insurance
That's
program.
absolutely not what actuarial logic is. It's a way of saying how
What?
much you will pay for someone to risk, basically a statistical assessment of their risk of dying. We're saying that process of
That's-
valuing people based on monetary claims is bad,
I think
right?
this is especially true in the context
Okay.
of the Haran card, which says that when you use that specifically in terms of debate, that spills up into issues of national security and allows the justification for the policies of World War II, where we can create Japanese internment camps because they are too big of a risk for the U.S. after Japan bombed Hawaii.
Okay, I get that saying people are risky to the social body is bad. I don't understand why putting a percentage value on a health insurance plan is bad.
Right, because
Often
it
what's bad-
calculates the value of a human life, which we're saying when you're able to do
Okay.
that, you're moving further
I know.
away from a shared vulnerability.
Rothman evidence says NHI discussions are about insurance, not about healthcare. Why does that mean you meet our interpretation?
The Rothman, so we're contesting what your view of insurance is, because you're necessarily excluding the social infrastructure that makes up parts of health, because insurance right now is what can we pay for, what medical costs can we cover, and instead we should look at things like social determinants of health, because I can go in and get an asthma inhaler and the government can pay for it, but that doesn't solve the fact that I'm living next to a place that is making me sick, or I'm in Flint,
sorry,
Michigan, and I
one more
can't have
question.
access to
Your
water, right?
Bristow evidence, so your argument that ethics is a new rule, how does this prevent AFs from just getting up and being like, racism is bad, that comes before T, you have to
Sure, I think a lot of K debate in the status quo is a difference between ethical subject formations, right? So pessimism versus futurism, or ethical orientations
So just
in
'cause you got to
different
speak
directions.
first, we
You
lose?
can have those debates about ethics, you just choose not to.
Alright, 54.
Thanks, John.
services. This is what that looks like. No, that's this is what that looks like.
Okay, start for 321.
Set 321?
Yep. sent out. Order's going to be the econ DA, then T government, T insurance, and case. Everybody good?
I did the same thing. I get scared when I put it on that side. I'm like, is that okay?
Oh, I just didn't want to because I'm talking here, so instead I'll speak in my laptop.
So one more time, it's economy, Fed, financing case?
Yeah, that is correct. Zero to is the contestation of whether or not the after-solar results in economic decline. It's only a question of the implications. To that argument, economic decline certainly results in a big scare war made of. It indicates that China and Russia would take this as an opportunity to attack the United States and would escalate. Escalate nuclear and nuclear an independent implication you should try. To avoid because millions, if not billions of people would die as a result of that. There are also independent reasons that the economy would be bad because the economic decline would be bad because bubbles popping or destruction of the economy always hurt. Marginalized people first. Additionally, that sort of chaos like the affirmative because no, it would not be something that people are overcome because all their arguments about care being good generally are not something that they can solve because the care context is only applied. The context of national health insurance choice one is that care is really a better way to understand that your affirmative does not do anything to solve that because you're only national health insurance, not care, so relates to security. They have made a spill for argument the choice the one AC, which is the reason you should definitely hear negative on these questions, especially when the choice makes a lot of broad sweeping claims about how care generally applies to indigenous people, the economy, or topic like they don't have a mechanism for solving that. You should definitely not affirm this question next to the utilitarianism argument. That's what you also went to this argument with the Horan evidence right on topically. Number two, you said big wars result big wars happen as a result of actual logic, which means you cannot critique utilitarianism as well. We also do not defend utilitarianism entirely. We say that economic decline is bad. One consequence of that would be a big scary war, which would obviously that additionally turns the case because recession causes health outcomes and the social state and this is magnified for vulnerable populations, durable fiat, infinite spending across all economic environments, being fully funded in a recession means less promised benefits, thus you at all 13. Recession might adversely affect health outcomes, economic effects, including unemployment, loss of savings, and foreclosure, and eviction, unpayable debt, health problems such as suicide, substance abuse, medical mortality rates decline, massive public health problems, recession effectiveness, austerity measures, delivery systems, social safety nets, unemployed people, and public health insurance programs, other percent of the government programs receive less money from programs, and programs to continue putting the revenue as their revenue streams evaporate and decline causes trouble rate, the healthcare budget, everything. The answer is to do decline 17. Neoliberal politics given a process of overtaking essential services and undercover social sort of crisis when we have no choice to go for healthcare workers are attracted moments of cataclysm and it turns the very institutions of care that relies on would build out government 17. Hospitals would be destroyed, doctors died, dead, no remaining equipment, supplies, medicine, as because under bombs would inside civilization need. The next argument that they make is that the economic focus papers over disenfranchised population is skilling evidence to criticism of applying war metaphors to the economy, which is clearly not us. We're not saying that we should have a war economy or using a sort of metaphorical rhetoric like that, which means we don't link that argument. It's also evidence criticizing the economic collapse also begs the question of the internal link of the impact, which the 2EC does not concede to hold the one area arguments that were made, and the 2EC was the only that was just the three arguments that they made the 2EC. It's impossible to get 2ECs in a situation because we couldn't possibly predict what they would do. Move on to the T, government. There we meet our argument is irrelevant in this context because we're going for the insurance arguments. You do not meet this argument because you provide care, you do not provide insurance, which means this argument is irrelevant. They say, I don't think care is an HI. This is the Rothman evidence. This evidence says right to health would be an HI, which is definitely not the affirmative. This is also a criticism of a focus on medical services rather than care, which is definitely not our interpretation. Our interpretation is that you have to, you can only fund insurance rather than providing care in the first place. They say that our interpretation only results in state's politics across this counterclaim. It's not sure they've conceded the internal links on our topicality arguments that it's about having adequate case arguments and counterclaims in APS, and community care arguments or negative counterclaims. Additionally, all of their private insurance bad arguments should be guaranteed negative remedies that firmly should be entitled. That should be required within that we should establish a national health insurance system. That's why the word insurance is in the resolution. They've also not read a counter-interpretation of what the word insurance means, which means you should default or adorning evidence on this question. They can only finance insurance because risk is a crucial internally to all of our grand arguments. They say debate about policy solutions. You have conceded those arguments are good in the first place. Those are the first lane sevens, the first piece of lane sevens they read in the money. Say that establishing health policy is crucial, which means that having debates for establishing that policy are critical. Your access to the will solve the referendum, which means our interpreters they better resolve that argument. They should reject this vague zero policy failure argument. They make the Tuesday there's no internal link to care spilling over outside the healthcare industry, which is the argument I made on the economy, nor is there any explanation of what the result of that zero policy failure is, how they would be able to resolve those arguments. They say counter-interpretation debate should be about universal comprehensive care. No, it should not. It should be about universal comprehensive health insurance. It's better internal link to be learning about healthcare findings, which is a crucial determinant mechanism. You can also that would also be able to resolve all the arguments about actuarialism is bad because you provide insurance for absolutely everything. Which means there will be no longer be any risk calculus. So yes, there is a topic version of the app that will resolve all arguments about actuarialism bad. We would guarantee links to all of our case arguments about insurance being bad as well as counterclaims that say insurance is insufficient. We should establish an interest instead. The next argument they make is reasonability. You should not prove reasonability on this question because we have an exclusive definition of the difference between healthcare and health insurance, which is the conventional evidence from the T insurance page. This is a reason that your firm is not reasonable. You should also prefer competing interpretations of this question to evaluate the other relative impact comparison between whatever the firm's vague educational impacts are and arguments of fairness and limits. You should evaluate procedural and fairness questions first because they are critical prerequisites to any of the education arguments that they make. Having ground people to test the firm's truth content is a prerequisite to be able to learn anything about that education. We don't have anything to say on the case. Obviously, we won't learn very much about actuarialism in the first place, which is the reason that they cannot access any of their offense over their interpretation. The argument about topicality minority body size to the margins does not make any sense in this context because it just requires that people defend the establishment of health insurance. That the burden is just that people have to have access to care. They can resolve it with financing. Yes, every solution is not perfect, but the firm is not entitled to perfect ground, which is the reason they should not be able to get access to the argument that we should just provide care to everyone. The argument about the after resolving persuasive skills is not about the ethics of care, which means you should not evaluate this argument. We're also not going for this argument skills impact anyway, so it doesn't matter. Move on to the T insurance page. Sorry, it's got messy. Most of the counter-interpretation and we meet arguments were on that page. They cross-applied here, so I just did it there. Actuarial logic is good. If actuarial logic bad is a negative argument, I've already made that argument above. They say turns education, they haven't extrapolated why the app is able to solve that or why their interpretation is able to solve that, especially in the context of care, because that's a neg argument. There's no reason that actuarial logic results in war or why the app can solve it, which means you should refer the impacts to precision and limits, otherwise it spikes out of negative counterclaims and case arguments. Prefer a definition because they have intent to find terms that are actually in the resolution, which would be the grounding for all of our debates on this topic. Move on to case. There's absolutely no way that from themselves any of their case arguments, especially any of the spillover arguments, they have not responded to the forward evidence. And the one and say yes, the affirmative might include some sort of control of social determinants of health, but it's not able to resolve in an effective manner. When I see cross-sections, they build community health clinics and take into consideration things like coal plants, but this is not able to resolve broader structural determinants of health, like people who live in New Orleans who experience hurricanes and flooding that definitely are detrimental to their health. They can't all these arguments. They additionally say that access is crucial determinant, but they have an isolated where community health clinics would be built, or how that is able to facilitate access for anyone. There's only one sense. Someone is crossing down any evidence about how that ethics secure actually gets materially implicated. The main office of the firm is providing access being good and disparities being really bad, but if they don't have any solvency argument for why community health clinics or ethics of care is able to spill over from our discussions in this room to that means you should vote negative presumption because their firm is playing the result of community health clinics don't actually do anything. They say accurate calculations of the value of human life are really bad. You obviously do this too with your criticism of Utah that we should prejudice somebody's over others, which means that you are the only ones who are engaging in a sort of particular evaluation of human life. They say biopolitics impact. No, we do not concede this argument. We said insurance was good or down. Mulligan evidence is excellent on this question. It says that there's there's no unified insurance left because people have different determinants over whether whether they have access to particular services or not. There's no unified market left because some insurance companies do provide coverage that is effective at resolving people's security and not. It is a whole lot better than people not having insurance or being underinsured, which results in stress and fear health outcomes and premature death, which means that insurance is able to overcome this sort of biopolitical management, which is far worse than a world without community insurance. They've also not responded to our tours, which indicates community health clinics are really, actually, I'm not going to make that argument. The Wolf evidence about actuarial logic being dead is from 1896 and concedes that people disagreed with them at the time, and that argument hasn't continued in the present.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First to clarify, the T argument you're going for is the MHI, not the W one.
Yeah, it's the, like, you have to do insurance, you can't do care.
Okay.
I was just answering the, like, interp stuff, and I figured the one I was going to cross-apply offense anyway, so I didn't know this.
Okay, so on the skilling evidence, your only answer to that is that it's just metaphors of war are bad. This part,
I have another answer too. Yeah, I also said begs the question of the internal link and the impact to the economy, which you can see.
Right, so I don't actually think that's true. The card indicates that the way we think about the economy is always based on calculations that never take into account all people or all forms of like the outside of the economy, inside and outside the formal economy, which means that we're only manifesting those wars elsewhere. What about your answer that is just a, like, I don't understand your answer to that at all.
I disagree with your reading of this evidence. I don't think it's not about taking, I don't think it's saying that we don't take into account particular bodies in the context of war or economic crisis. It just says that in a competitive economy, we really consider economic life through problems of national security. We've said, yes, that's true. We have evidence to support that conclusion, and your evidence is just saying that this is a thing that we consider, and there might be consequences to that.
Okay, I don't think that's true. On T, you say, what's the ground loss?
Case arguments is the biggest ground loss. You say that insurance is bad, which should be negative ground, and we lose access to our best counterclaims about improving private insurance and National Health Service.
Why? Improving private insurance is definitely competitive.
Yeah, no, that was dumb. I shouldn't have said that. But community health clinics and NHS would be ground that we would lose. But I think case arguments are our biggest beef with the app.
Sure. You say just read the app and the neg. What about an ethic of care is competitive with the single payer app?
You've read Reason's insurance logic is bad.
Right.
Linked to an insurance act.
So competitive positions mean that we would have to be fundamentally opposed to healthcare. We're always going to lose on a perm. If you are saying that read on the neg, you're actively excluding our education. I want to know how you think that competition story works.
Well, judging by the number of debates we've lost on the NHS counterclaim, I would disagree on that competition question. It's definitely possible to lose that. And you can still say that insurance is bad. Like, tons of teams have been racking up wins on the actuarialism K on the neg.
You say, or you don't have a defense of insurance as a mechanism that's good to learn about in debate. Am I missing something on part of the T-flow that defense insurance is something that's good to learn about?
No, I didn't make an insurance argument.
So we had a ton of evidence about why learning about insurance is absolutely shitty. Why would you get a ballot for advocating that we should learn about it?
Well, we've made case arguments about why providing insurance to people is particularly good to remedy.
Okay, who can access that insurance? I'll answer that for you, it's white people.
Can I use that really fast?
Yeah, go for it. I'm gonna use water.
Good point.
Totally not even scared.
There was one time I had this horrible team. I was with my partner Fernando, and we were shit, and we were getting our asses kicked. And this team, and our judge left, and we were like flying around on Facebook, and they're like, "Are you still in prep?" And stood behind us to make sure we were not still in prep. I'm like, even if we were, you were still handedly winning. Like, what do you want from us?
Yeah, like, let us steal prep shit.
Yeah, shit.
Maybe you'll have a better debate that way.
No, I had a team once that like stood over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't stealing prep when they were literally kicking our ass. I'm just like, what are you doing?
Yeah, like 4 years ago on our team, one of our teams was debating a first round and just like getting wrecked, and then they were like, "You clip cards, you should lose," and then they lost on the clipping challenge.
Nice. Well, good.
Yeah, you
It
shouldn't.
is shitty.
You shouldn't put cards, but I think it's funny this team is like, yeah, we don't want to continue beating them down. We'll just be like, you put cards, you lose now.
Yeah, what the fuck?
Whew. Do you need power? How you doing?
I'm doing okay.
What's that? What are you at?
60%.
Okay, that's 75, so.
Do you have one treasure to share?
No, we have two, but his is like doesn't have the extension, so it's kind of a thing to.
I don't know why would I send me this link?
All right. Put that one in there back there.
I did.
Okay, so you can see it. There you go. Hold your computer here. I'm gonna tighten this up. It's not on the ground. Just hold your computer. I want to like. Just hold it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Maybe the critique. There is a structural difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. The affirmative has failed to theorize, so even if when they resolve some forms of colonial violence, implementation fails because there is an imperative to delineate a unique path for settler decolonization, which requires an absolute rejection of transcendental mobility that undergirds the ontological sovereignty of settler subjectivity. Colonialism is hell on earth for racialized people in a permanent state of war. Indigenous people who were fortunate enough to survive the physical act of genocide now have to contend with a world that considers them to be dispensable and commits intellectual and spiritual genocide against them, which means that we have an external impact of colonization of the mind through discursive language that creates historical trauma. We also have an ontology. Colonialism results in the ontological erasure of natives making genocide committed against them legitimate and possible, while the death threat does not eradicate subjectivity. That's Rifkin. The role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best has the best method for combating oppressive power structures. It's crucial to flip debates, logocentric calculus, to center the experience of oppressed persons within debate. Any other role of the ballot inevitably marginalizes those experiences. It's also fair because they can engage specific prescriptions of the K, but should be held accountable for how their affirmative facilitates a larger economy of violence toward indigenous queer perspectives. Go to the line by line. They say no link. I tip my hand and cross-X, and they still have not engaged with the nuance of our first link argument. Do not let them resurrect it in the 1AR. The first link argument is care. Yes, they think medicalization is a problem, but they treat it as emerging from a well-meaning but naive policy discourse, i.e. their Lance et al. Evidence from the 1AC. That is wrong and obscures the role that medicalization has had as an actively underwriting settlement, as described by our Durazo evidence. Insofar as they don't challenge settlement, it simply gets the role of medicalization simply gets replicated even in a holistic conception of care, or it ends up letting neoliberal medicalization off the hook because sometimes it's okay when the problem genuinely is individual pathology and the solution is actually a medical cure, which means that natives are still subject to biomedical regimes, but with a nice new sheen of care that's only available to depressed white women, because diabetes is, on the other hand, actually an individual medical disease. The second link is land. The act results in new community clinics built on stolen land. The ethical priority is to reject these practices of settlement. A subpoint, historically, those clinics are parasitic on settlement because it is those violences that create demand for clinics in the first place. Their continued operation relies on ongoing colonial violence to justify their existence. This is magnified by the fact that in the 1AC they notice that healthcare is affected by structures like inequality, but they have not provided any mechanism to resolve those except building more clinics. B subpoint, the building of clinics are a means of whitewashing settlement, making it pure tolerable and palliating revolutionary decolonization by creating conditions of dependence, because the occupation of land itself denatures cultural relationships between indigenous people and with the land that make it impossible to actualize forms of indigenous caring, which means that the K turns the case, not the other way around. To the extent that their forms of care are incorporated in community clinics, they're treated as infinite and exhausted through exploitation, which also naturalizes
characterizes a consumptive relationship to the land as the primary source of care, which is a conceded DA from the case in the 1 and C, which is our Fraser evidence. The impact to both of these is genocide and extinction, respectively. C subpoint is the spatial metaphor of the 1AC Rifkin evidence says that settler claims to possession are naturalized by everyday modes of inhabiting space. You should refuse their orientation toward ethics of care because caring settlers are still fucking settlers, which means that it's simply a move to innocence to distance themselves from their responsibility not to care for natives, but to get out of the way. D, the fourth link is erasure. They erase the existence of natives, naturalized and already gone. That's our Morganson evidence. They just assert you shouldn't vote on links of omission. This is different because we think that link is based on a strategic selection of which forms of care they endorse in the 1AC. Permutation. First, in severance, we have links to the discourse of their critique of medicalization, the way they think of conceptualized care, and we also have a linear disadd to their construction of clinics, which means that all of the links are disadds to the permutation. Additionally, they do not defend an they do not defend a fiated national health insurance plan, but only an orientation to an ethic of care, which means that they could have chosen any ethic they wanted in the 1AC, and they should be accountable for that choice. It means that if we win any risk of a topicality argument, or even if we don't, they have already made their choices, and you should not grant them a permutation in this debate.
Also, it's mutually exclusive. Just identify with the F.
It's mutually exclusive to disidentify with the F and vote half. And yeah, the impact of severance is that it makes the F a moving target. It's impossible to debate them, and it lets people say racist things and then just spike out of them to do bad stuff. All right, and the affirmatives move to bridge the gap from their political project to indigenous problem, homogenizes the conditions of colonialism, a seemingly innocent move, propagates a vague ontological account that mystifies the structure of settlerism, tuck and yang and 12. Sympathy and suffering are used to ignore the native others' differences, not the I, not I into the I, the settlers feeds a fantasy of mutuality. This beauty of settler fantasy is that it adopts decolonization and aborts in one gesture. Decolonization is rendered irrelevant more than once moved to innocence, the homogenizing of various experiences of oppression is colonization, calling different groups colonized without describing this relationship to settler colonialism is equivocation, describing all sorts of decolonizing creates a convenient ambiguity among people of color, people in other groups minoritized by the settler state. We are all colonized, it's deceptively embracive and vague, and for some of us, for settlers, equivocation is especially vague in coalition politics. They say we reimagine care outside of scarcity. We have impact from them. They say disidentification can't access responsibility. That is not true. It does access responsibility. It's a responsibility to avoid divestment from your culpability as settler, as advocating settler politics. Obscures colonizer, colonized, very wrong. Only the AF does that because they said, we affirm care generally, and then they took the opportunity in the 2AC to be like, that means all care is the same. This homogenizes the distinctions between indigenous forms of care and European forms of care that they try to appropriate just for a ballot.
8 minutes.
8.
Yes.
Will you take a little bit of time? Okay. One smoke, no cheat.
Fall 2016 because I realized I could Virginia and I didn't have to be there, so I moved back a year ago. I worked in a bakery for a few months, and then currently I'm up in Madison, Washington, which is about 45 minutes away from the Canadian border. I'm transferring as a student at Washington University. I'm a barista, and then I'm helping coach policy for the Bellingham United Debate Club up there. Because the high schools there, they don't have enough at each high school, so it's all one big like district.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
it's super chill. What about you?
Just
been in high school and then did 5 years.
Oh, so the same thing.
And now I'm doing this. I guess I coach. I coach at I did, I guess, right down here. So last year of college, I started coaching and then I thought I didn't really like it mostly because my bosses were, I don't want to say rude, but that environment.
Definitely question attention.
And then started figured it out. Do this. Yeah.
Oh, that's super chill.
Yeah. So, get government deals and we send money.
Can you work that out? Okay.
So I moved down in February.
Yeah.
It's going to be a 2-hour drive away, but half hour from my parents' house, I am definitely coming.
Yeah, you can't like miss one of those opportunities.
Exactly, and I'm coaching policies at like Western on my house partly team.
That sucks.
And then I also feel really bad because one of my coworkers, her friend was a regular at the shop, and was like one of the like main girls on the team, and so she's always like, you should join, and I'm like, it's not policy.
Yeah. Yeah, people say policy's pretty elitist, but it's like, it's kind of true.
Yeah, it definitely is, but it's,
Well,
I still, I love it. I enjoy it, and I don't want to come back.
I'm the same way. I tried to be in high school and before this was like, no.
I was got voted into one public forum when I was a one term when I was a sophomore in high school, but other than that, it was all policy. My older brother did LD, and that's how I got started participating. It was just because when he was a freshman, I was in 8th grade, so like high school stuff. He was like, debates, academic, and he was like a 13-year-old like 9th grade. He was like, yeah, it's so smart. Smart people do it. You couldn't do it. It's like, really? No, no, no.
No.
But has been another debate.
My mom, I was an 8th grader and we were like doing like one of the classes, whatever. And my mom was like, do like arguments, we should do things. Okay, what is it? She was like, they teach you how to like, do argument structure and whatnot. So it was wild. It was actually, I don't know, really interesting, but whenever I did, it was still in the NFL.
Yeah, I'm 21, so I graduated high school 2013.
Okay, so I am 25, so I graduated, 12, but yeah, I do, like these like NFL like letters that was like, here's what it is drafted into the NFL.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, actually, you would.
I didn't know you were planning on going back.
Yeah, right. I was like, yeah, just going to Matrix.
Totally.
Yeah. But then it was, I don't know why you're even it didn't make sense.
I'm gonna kick
Or
there.
yeah,
I'll kick the
okay.
speaker.
I don't want to stop because I have 3 minutes left.
Excellent management in this debate.
Oh,
Even
this
numbers.
is a fluke. It never happens. It's so
80 to
secret.
3.
Yeah.
You don't always prep in minute limits. All right.
It's just gonna, there's just one more card.
Cool. If you want to send it by email.
Okay. Hey, so can you actually email like I said, actually?
Which one?
Oh, yeah. Which one would you do from the
Alright, that should be sentence.
Okay, so the order is case, the disad, the K, and then the frameworks. I guess, I don't really know where, I'm not gonna go to separate frameworks, I don't really know where to put that. Oh.
I lost yours with the econ DA, so can you?
Oh, yeah, sorry, okay, so K's econ, K, and then, I guess I'll just start on the framework page and go on to.
Yeah, I don't know, I really screwed this up. So, that's
It
fair.
might be easier to just keep them all on one page.
Yeah, I kind of said
That's true,
everything
since the
on
only thing is
framework and
the
then just
actuarial,
like.
okay, yeah, we'll just go with that then.
Okay, so case, econ DA, critique, framework,
Yes, sounds good.
or government, sorry.
Can I please stand here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There you go.
Great. Is everyone good?
No presumption argument. You're for evidence we can't solve social determinants of health. But yeah, you say government insurance keeps solving health inequalities on case. These forms of policies will always lead to economic decline. This is only a reason why you always construct these two things in opposition to one another. The impact of this is the perpetuation of two toxic forms of mainstream partisanship, i.e. the political left that says we need to expand healthcare coverage, which is your case arguments, and the fascist right that says that will always lead to stated solutions that impact the economy. This forced choice whether over these policies impacts their framework argument, and every piece of argument they're fucking going for on case, because it's only a reason why their forms of debate over insurance can only recreate this form of neoliberal subjectivity in the context of impact. The only possible affirmative action re-territorializes economic rationality and risk logic onto bodies. Now, healthcare is a wicked problem because it cannot be resolved by instrumental policy alone. Traditional approaches assume mechanized health systems will be replaced without understanding the community. Health issues can only be solved via holistic means, i.e. an ethical care that understands the contingencies of these forms of violence, as the way health inequalities are perpetuated through social relationships, which means focusing on community health clinics as part of it, but it's also a question of things like mutual aid and acknowledgement of social determinants of health, which means the ethics of care can result in things like advocating for for environmental restrictions on things that cause coal-fired power plants. We're not restricted to community clinics, so all of these no solvency arguments don't make any sense in the context of an ethic of care. So you did a good job of that. And Swayze, you say that answers all their presumption arguments. Say actuarialism leads to the affirmative because of utilism weighing lives, but actuarialism is the same form of risk calculus that now monetizes human life and makes economic decisions based on that, which is distinct from our forms of from our criticism of utilitarianism. The only form of this is your econ deciding to go there. Obviously, there's no fucking link to this argument. I don't understand why you went for it, but there's only risk that this perpetuates often for an example of why you only recreate the stale debates of the text, which means we need to rupture the economic subjectivity that's constantly reformulated through the negative policies that seeks to hold on to social determinants of health, yet still chooses to address health concerns as merely economic issues. It is an active choice to let people die. This causes health inequalities emanating from deployment of this economic calculus rather than the law tells us the impact to actuarial logic in the context of healthcare. A reason to reject them as unethical, subject to construction of diverse populations, saying economic sustainability is unsustainable because perpetual economic crises are inherent to market capitalism. This is the scaling argument. It's not just a critique of war metaphors, downturns, and expansion to create ongoing crisis rhetoric that is weaponized against marginal people. Their use of calculus will always justify rationing social provision in response to perpetual crisis, which is also a reason why we are not using arguments to make any fucking sense. This should indicate all of the ground arguments that they're going for on T. They can't go for this. This is only a risk of offense against them. Now I'm going to go on to the criticism here. You should reject the team for reading this position on T. This new active by the USF. T. This key to education good mix and they redicate, which makes a role about this vote for the team that's best method for combating impressive structure. We will win in the US. This is the US. You can proselyte that to the T. Full of stories and reject the team because the education they want is bad. They can see that the ethical policy making use valid information means you when contradictions dissect their T argument reason why they can never enact the alternative. They're understanding the structural elements of the world are vulnerability structures. Colonials have the other way around. Like vulnerability allows for higher created devaluing life that makes it possible to continually raise native population, and you can extend the permutation of this identification. The way native communities can examine the economies and care outside the formal economy is key to solving the affirmative, because the only way to export vulnerability and then drop the communities is this identification of prescribed solutions. Only affirmative permutation allows for specific communities to access tactics that work for them now. And then you want me to read this card? Yeah. Okay. An ethic care is not universal, but global. It counts for social location, access, and power that necessitates understanding all people need and use care. Scheme 14. Care is the insensitive intersectionality, identity, pronouns, be reduced such as gender, race, and class, or people who meet their single gender research from classic characteristics, redetermines aliens, many categories, affairs, political, critical, the underground, and concrete activities of real people in the context of what's in social relations practice, the needs of that close conversation improves care about taking location and any walking mutually reinforce access to power that affect care. Now I'm going to go onto framework here. You say that we don't need it because we don't have to be insurance. We said that's good because you do not lead to portable skills, saying focusing only on insurance recruits of stale debates on the impacts of that on case and the disadvantage, which means even if you say we get something valuable out of these discussions, that's not true, because you will not have an advocacy that's actually political saleable. Your politics will never be actualized, which is the reason why we had to rupture these forms of economic subjectivity. It's a prior question to any forms of political engagement, which even if they win their fairness arguments, that's not going to outweigh education, which you should prioritize here now. There's other limitations supply that our criticism of insurance was selectively excluded to make the topic narrower and scope. We're critiquing the distinction between insurance and healthcare. We're saying that should have been the fucking topic wording. That's what we should focus on. But we also give you ground because we are reason why you have to require the expansion of things like medical care and care. It's just a criticism of a focus on insurance. It's the actuarial and that was on the dissent, and you say that that's key to ground. We're in
just a reason why our forms of education will always outweigh those, right? So you're not going to have internal to any of those arguments. You can extend our counter-interpretation as better, you should prefer it, not for the actuarial and dissent, but also for the best preserving ground while also creating ethical self-information that you should prioritize because, well, I did that work above now. You say in this, actually, how policy is key to solving the affirmative argument problem side of that. Okay, you say that interpretation is key to solving actuarialism. This is not true because you require us to advocate for insurance-based solutions, which means that also you don't have to top the to the affirmative. So this is not an actual argument, but an accurate answer to do on the negative argument to the affirmative and the negative doesn't solve our often the negative or in constant criticism of care ethics and the affirmation process that to recognize multiple discourses and histories as adults and to affirming on all directions. The only way to open up the possibility of policy to be arguing ethical care on the negative is contradictory because we would have to oppose healthcare, which is also a reason why we will always be in the direction of the topic, which is a reason why you should prefer not to you should prefer it from finally,
They say internally to fairness, that's not true. It's about the way that we produce knowledge on the ground. Gotcha.
Yeah, no, that's what you're saying.
Then you get through it.
Like, in,
yes.
Actually, I was.
I just love my teacher, my schoolers, and just like being able to kind of want to like English program. We have great teachers, so just like learning, like cultivating that for me. That's just been super duper nice. It's been cool.
Fair enough. The high school I coached at was in was in Emporia, and they're really good kids. I mean, I like them. I still know a few kids that I coached and talked to them. But yeah, I mean, it was a big deal, I guess. That's when I moved on to different career paths. It's, I can like, recently I think kind of realized like different careers is just too much more anymore. It's like, as a little older, I'm very invested in the community. And I'm like, I'm much more just like kind of backseat perspective, like watching everything. Like, yeah.
It's been really fun to just be a parent, kind of, because that's just been the reason I haven't seen so far, and it's been strange.
Yeah, and it's not work. I know it's like huge around it, but that's the one thing I have to do. I can judge them. So I need to judge different. I can judge our different high school districts. Well, the way Kansas is they have
It wouldn't be the first time you read 2 in our cards. It would probably be the last time.
Yeah.
You read 2 hours.
Oh, totally. I've read multiple 2 in our card. I think my max is 3. It's just sometimes more than I read the 2 in C. But it happens. Mostly that's my 2 in C. Okay. So the order is going to be the critique, and the case, and then I'm going to clean up econ DA. Is everyone ready?
That's what it's on. Or the case, econ. Gotcha.
The affirmative locks in a transcendental subject and governmentality of mobility that renders native peoples and their lands disposable. The impact of that is the continuation of historical trauma of settlement in the present by continually taking land and legitimating settlement also legitimates the continued removal of Indians and the perpetration of genocide through the development of new gentrified community health clinics on stolen. They have conceded the rule of the ballot is the best methodology to combat oppressive power structures and its fair base allows the affirmative engagement with the negative method of combating those structures that can determine the way you decide this decision based on whether the affirmative is able to resolve not only the impacts to their case, but also how they relate to their own subjectivity and their own ethical subjectivity, which is an argument that 1AR makes on topicality of creating ethical subjects being a unique educational burden. This is the reason that you should prioritize this methodology of combating oppressive power structures, because that is your role as an educator in the context of this debate argument. I will answer the first 1AR argument about preferred contradictions. We have 4 arguments. One, this is a new argument. The 1AR we explicitly made arguments as to why the 1AR should not be intended to sandbagging because it makes the debate. The 2 are impossible also makes the affirmative moving target based their offense as continually shifting. Second argument is the 2EC dynamic and conditionality argument. The 2EC, which means that we should be entitled to be able to go for the criticism, even though we are topical. The third argument is that our new rule of the ballot argument was justified in a world where this was the 2R means that we should not reject the team in the context of this argument, because the rule of the ballot was the best methodology to combat oppressive power structures. The fourth argument is the plan. The plans are not an ethical endorsement of the United States for our criticism. Our criticism does not mean debates about policy are uniquely bad, but our topicality argument is that we should have guaranteed link grounds to that. Our criticism of the provision of insurance and providing care to people in the first place. We may have been wrong about about topicality, we may have lost the topicality in the context of this argument, but that is not the reason that they have proven that there is a link between defending the United States federal government and the criticism that we've articulated. The one who is not providing a warrant for why defending the United States federal government is linked to any sort of settler ontology process, settler colonialism, which is a reason we should hold the two AR a very, very high threshold being able to explain this argument, considering the one AR did not get the job in on this question. The next argument they make is the permutation. There's no explanation of what the permutation is or why it is able to solve any of our link arguments. We have impact turn the affirmative. The first link argument is the land link argument, which they've absolutely conceded it. The development of community health clinics is the continued construction of new centers, which widens the violence of settler colonialism by continually bringing colonization to the present. This also fosters dependence of indigenous people onto the government for the quality of their care, which nationalizes a consumption conceptual relationship to land able to provide services, which is the basis of all of their argument about which is the basis for all their arguments about why biopolitics.
Even if it seems silly, it was conceded.
Yeah. Even if this argument seems silly, which I don't think it should, they've conceded this argument, and we have established a clear impact to why taking land and continual process of settler colonialism result in the violent elimination of indigenous peoples in the present, which is a form of historical trauma that you should reject as an implication to psychic violence. Also, the lack of impact defense means you should definitely, with this consideration particularly highly, especially if you think the alternative can solve the case. The other link arguments are careful. Their critique of medicalization is merely a mystification. No one sees discourse via the Wayne's evidence. Thinks medicalization is a given. It severs from a history of colonization that created demand for a discourse to pathologize indigenous people in the first place. They have not explained how their holistic care can displace rather than merely supplement the biomedical paradigm. In any case, the mystification of histories of settlement ensures that new discourses parallel to medicalization engage to meet that demand. The alternative can also solve the entirety of the case. The one AR evidence says that care ethics can be particularized means that affirming the uniqueness of indigenous forms of care by disidentifying with their homogenizing mantras of responsibility, attentiveness, or responsiveness is magnified by the attempt of the CDC to say that hey, because we talked about care, it means we can weigh indigenous care ethics against your kid. This means they link to the community disadvantage because it means they link worse than we do because what's this?
Disidentification
Oh, yeah,
has always been about
yeah.
explaining the differences between their care and our care.
Yeah. Disidentification has always been about explaining the difference between the type of care that we think is good and the type of care that they think is good. They've also independently conceded that they do not get a permutation because they did not read a topical affirmative, which means that they could have picked any ethic of care or any ethic that they wanted, which means that they shouldn't be entitled to that argument. They've also conceded the argument that disidentification is mutually exclusive, which means that there's literally no situation for the permutation to be effective. Okay, the community view doesn't only allow certain communities to get care. It provides people the ability to provide care for themselves, as well as people who are not indigenous to access that care if they would like to. There's also no explanation for what the implication of this argument is or why that outweighs the continual destruction of indigenous people. The next argument they make is that ethics of care is global. This evidence, one, does not say anything about indigenous people, which is the link to our strategic silence argument about a continual incorporation of indigenous people into the full fold of other folks. Additionally, if their ethics of care is global, and our link arguments are true, it just means they export settler colonialism globally, which just magnifies our link arguments.
We don't need to win an alternative.
Yeah.
Rejecting them.
We don't need to win an alternative. If this debate is about creating ethical subjects, which they have said is a good idea, we should reject them for creating unethical subject formations in the context of settler colonialism.
And if it's about consequences, then you should reject new clinics because they're built on stolen land.
Yeah, and if it's about consequences, you should reject the affirmative because they built clinics on stolen land. Alright, the economy deal. You should not reject this idea as unethical. We've said that economic decline is bad because it results in health disparities. We're not going to go for the disadvantage, but there are consequences to, what would happen for the economy. And yeah. What else? Yeah, that's fine. T, we're not going for it, but all their actuarialism arguments and risk calculation arguments relate to how they evaluate settler bodies versus indigenous bodies, which means they link to circumcision.
Yeah.
a little bit like, not a little bit nervous, I'm like, oh, I thought I don't make it my work today, or they know that you're just gotta get into that there.
Right. Sure can. I mean, just chill some friends and
Exactly. I was in the same for a year and a half ago. I become a big strong I met two engineering leaders when I went to NFL Mass my senior year because they were judging for grad run high school, and so they were at the tournament too, and they're like, oh hi, and what time are you skating on the street? And that was and then I helped with Jamie, but I think still wasn't after, but it was nice listening to
I found that I was a freshman and all my friends were just on the weeks. I was like, man, I wish I could make friends.
yeah, like half the people in my home didn't know who I was because I was there so little, or I would just be like leaving so early and coming back so late. I just wouldn't be around. But no, I kind of really well. I think like, oh, you're that.
The one of the things imaginary.
Exactly, and it didn't help freshman year, I changed my hair color a little bit everyone, so.
Oh, yeah. Only for a little bit. I went to Emporia. I've only been doing for like 2 months. And then I started meeting someone, and then they were out of the classroom, so.
Oh, on campus.
Yeah, so they live on campus, and they're like, you should just live with me. And I was like, okay. I was like, it's a way better deal. You know, what things I have. And the one was, different.
Emporia, by the way. And I know it's like,
I don't know if you've ever been to Vegas.
yeah, I drove through it.
Okay, so you know what Topeka is?
Yeah.
Okay, it's like 45 minutes an hour to the southwest, barely.
Oh.
Let's see, it's like right in that little. It's where it can start getting
What?
It's where like it starts getting hungry. It's a really dignified, I can give you.
Okay, it's gonna be case review and then, okay. Everyone good? Cool. It's you, okay, next time I was getting break, but. Alright. Status quo approaches to healthcare reinforces the belief that patients are atomized risk calculating consumers and neoliberal medical complex systems care is a scarce commodity. This forecloses questioning the conditions that create risk and scarcity in care in the first place. This kind of actuarial logic relies on the cost benefit calculation that distances people from caring for others and disincentivizes viewing life as inherently valuable and uncalculable. That's how random system it is. Without this understanding of shared vulnerability, the affirmative securitizes those of people in places that provides the justification to put the value of one life against another, making biopolitical expansion at home and inevitable vulnerability structure versus colonialism structure. They don't get to read that see, we have to defend the USFG or the econ dissent and say that the devaluation of some lives is safer, the nuclear war is good, and proves that they don't actually give a shit about the education or epistemology. In this round, they only debate natives for a ballot means that they can never win the roll of the ballot because they go for the econ dissent and USFG argument that functions as a worse model of debate because their argumentation is literally the logic of colonialism is reinforced and it silences the ethical injunction that they're trying to go for. It means they can never actually implement or solve the alternative because the performance they have around this is not a conditionality argument. Rather, it's about how you can't access your alternative or any of the education or ethical claims of the alternative or any kind of solvency from it, or that it solves the affirmative because they don't set those issues as a priority need to come first only in the last speech, which means it's only commodifying those native identities, lands, and every link that they read to for them to get a ballot. You should affirm the rest of your decision through that. Also, I'm going to.
Wait. On that, they say this is a new argument. That's because the roll of the ballot was in the 2NC, so obviously I'm going to answer that in one error.
Right. Can't answer roll the ballot as ethical injunction. Also, on T, we read that ethics should come first in the 2NC. So you can just cross-apply that argument. It's been in the debate the whole time. Also, they say that their overarching structural claim is that colonialism is what structures the world, but their understanding of that structuring element is wrong. They have conceded this vulnerability analysis from the top of the 1NR, which says that the vulnerability structures colonialism and not the other way around. A lack of vulnerability allows for hierarchies to be created through the valuing and devaluing of lives, i.e. colonialism is a function of that removal of vulnerability between the colonizer and the colonized, which is able to allow for those people to be continually silenced and pushed to the side. Means that the affirmative souls for the impacts of the critique may have to go for a fucking permutation because the affirmative souls did better in the first place. Now, but you can extend the permutation anyways because it's a use of a disidentification as a way that Native communities can examine economies of care inside and outside the formula economy, which is key to solve the affirmative because it's the only way that you can use vulnerability to exploit. Now, this permutation argument is not really a permutation, but rather a no-link argument because they can't access the affirmative if their understanding of the structures of colonialism are wrong in terms of vulnerability, which even if you don't buy that argument, it's dropped in the 2NR. Now, they say community health centers are built on stolen land, which is a link to the cave, but and we can see that not talking about the land is bad, but all of the vulnerability arguments are reasons why an ethic of care is how those subordinated groups are able to survive in the status quo because they can create things like community centers or native activism or the Maori and Ubuntu people who literally use an ethic of care to fight neoliberal policies that New Zealand forces onto them. Those are all examples of native groups that are able to access. So it's not a link of exclusion because our philosophical praxis of an ethic of care and attentiveness, responsiveness is how we're able to access now. Now, basically, medicalization, mystified settlement, we are able to solve for that through the vulnerability arguments, which is how you should be framing the entire round in the first place because we're able to solve for the part of medicalization that is able to devalue the lives or use it as a way to perform medical testing or other types of medical injustices. Now, they say that the alternative solves the case. The alternative can never solve the case because the way that they frame the alternative is about epistemological structuring, and they can't access that because they have never had a consistent epistemological stance. They have never had an ethical stance. They've taken only in the 2NR, and guess what? That's too fucking late for you to be able to win on that. Now, they also say that we conceded that we don't get a permutation. Sure, we don't have to win that because you're not winning a substantial link. And an ethic of care is a philosophical praxis that utilizes the praxis of attentiveness, responsiveness of the affirmative, contextualizes this to healthcare and endorses an ethic of care as a community care-centered means of rupturing economic subjectivity through things like kinships and relationship formation. And this theory is global but not universal, which means it's actualized in different communities, but we don't need a permutation because we have always had compatible framing with the K and indigenous care ethics is a single facet of a broader theory that our affirmative affirms in the first place. Now, this is how you should understand that Native communities utilize an ethic of care through indigenous care the communities district only applies to them because they're not the ones who are talking about those communities in the first place.
Here we go. Thank you.
How we doing?
Pretty good. Well, I'm glad they were not here to see that.
I told Sarah this, and I didn't get a chance to say it this. I haven't seen you debate in 2 years. You've gotten so good.
Thank you.
It's like, damn girl. Bless
A
you.
little better than novice year, right?
Oh man, right, you started as a novice my freshman year. Oh man, I remember that. You were paired with Chelsea?
Paired is a really strong word because I wrote all the speeches. So Chelsea was my backpack. Sure. I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
Our clothes used to be 80 pages stacked on each other.
You told me. I believe you. I believe you.
That's what people were so confused when we're like, we need an entire fucking like ream of flow. Like, what? Why? per tournament? Like, yes.
So what all was in the 1NC?
They read T government plus NHI, T government plus NHI again, but lots of emphasis on the NHI this time. Econ just had and colonialism K.
Okay.
I don't really understand the difference between. They explained it as like one is gov and one is gov plus NHI, but they kind of just collapse into one after.
One is just defend the state so we have competition for things. One is
Yeah.
give us insurance background.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because the big is fun.
I think they're smoking. Yep. Those dudes look like goddamn genius.
Who?
Ohio innovators.
Oh.
I'm like, I hope they brought some with them because Washington they're like $10 a pack. Yeah,
That's
we have so
bullshit.
many taxes on them.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Like,
I was talking to somebody that told me that it's like illegal to bring packs of cigarettes into like New York City, like from like outside of the city. Yeah, like and if you're caught with, because they like have a special marking on them, like and so if they catch you with a pack and it doesn't have that marking on them, then yeah,
that's so petty.
it's it's super petty. It's just because like they have like super high taxes on them, it's like $14 a pack or something up there. Yeah.
They're like, weed's almost cheaper here, which is a last thought.
So I was kind of listening for like things from like the block onward. And maybe I heard this wrong. But was there like a death good argument at some point?
No.
They I think they just had that in their blocks from debating someone else.
Okay.
Because I saw that too and I was like, what? But I just,
I thought I heard that. And
Yeah.
I was like, huh?
yeah, the one in our,
Yeah. Okay. So what was the 2AR about?
The 2AR, sorry, give me 1 second. The 2AR was an extension of the performance dispatch, which was like you don't get to say that ethics and epistemology should come first and then read conflicting ethical and epistemological stances. Like a extension of the vulnerability argument is a way to understand settler colonialism, not the other way around. So the affirmative is necessary solves the alternative kind of argument, kind of style. Those are like the main two I went for. I answered some of the other stuff just with those, because that's kind of what we did.
Okay.
And we did concede the no perm stuff, but I think I just said, fuck that perm.
Sad times.
It happens. Oops, sorry.
Also, I can't believe anyone thinks no perms.
I read that last round.
It's not an argument.
No perms are not the debate.
It's not a real argument. Stop.
You want to choose after this? Why does it already feel like 8 o'clock at night?
Because you're used to being 3 hours ahead of right now, or it is just about exactly 8 o'clock at night.
Is it? Yeah, 2, 3, 4. That's so
No,
false.
it's 3 hours. It is 3 hours. The
Wow.
time difference between Washington and Virginia is 3 hours, so it's 4:30 in y'all's heads.
Whatever.
I feel dead. Regardless.
I mean, true.
So our core novices, we're debating on what using this, like, parafiction is cool.
Did you give them the fiction and math cards?
I don't know where they were. And I was like, we're not gonna have a whole lot of success coaching them up on that.
So what did they say?
Well, so this is one of those things where Nathan kind of made a decision, and I was like, well, he's been working with them. We'll roll with it.
Nathan?
Yeah.
Is he here?
No, but he hadn't really coached him up on framework. He said, we'll go with neoliberalism instead. And I'm like, oh, just let the novices pick the shiny thing. Whatever. So there was a neoliberalism debate that was able to be explained, but probably is not hyper competitive. So we'll see. But I think for next year, by the time we get to this part of the season, the curriculum will be the whole framework for the novices.
Yeah. I think that's like
Slash,
the first thing.
next year, yeah, slash next year, there will be a curriculum.
The first time I ran framework, I was not, this was against the Bacon team at our JV tournament, which was held in the fall.
Yeah.
It was like the second tournament I've been to, and I remember halfway through the round just being like, I don't even know what to say. I don't know what this is. Luke tried to explain it to me, and I was just like, what? What?
Sounds about right.
He's like, but these things, and then they can't say these things. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
It was a hot ass mess. And eventually it just became a, I can't say anything, so you should vote for me anyways.
Yeah. That's the thesis. That's the thesis.
I want more coffee.
And then Ashley and Fern were debating an anti-blackness pessimism team.
Man,
Which I feel like 85% get about.
so tired.
And like,
It's basically
if they lose, it's gonna be that they lost because
we were uploading.
they didn't figure out how to sell
Okay.
it.
Go to bed, yeah. So I'm just like laying down here because I'm too
Because
tired
I was like,
to
so what's your
like I'm too
framework?
tired
And Ashley's
to like
like, I don't know.
even
Just
like
move
I'm like,
and
what's
like pay attention to this because I'm also like too tired that I know if I go to bed, I'm just not gonna do it. And so I was like, I'll just
We were right now.
and then at some point in time, I forgot that our plan, and I just went to bed.
This is where.
So rough.
It was pretty bad, but yeah. And I felt stupid running this morning also. So yeah, apparently I'm very tired.
Like, accidentally, like, nearly, like, nodding off during the sounds is, like, the weirdest thing. I just, because you're like, all these people are so tuned.
It was literally the weird.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, it reminds me of fall asleep in class.
And then
It's
just,
like, everyone's just paying attention to this, or is like just pretending to be interested in this.
Has it been
so
2 minutes
in
or
the,
20?
Yeah,
one
right.
area, like you can't say,
What time did it though?
I think it
you can't
was,
affirm this
it was probably before
context for
midnight.
theory, and then
Probably
apparently
around midnight,
also and the
actually.
K, put three words together, which then turned into a personal argument at the end, and I only
sharing that little
answered
Airbnb.
the link.
Just down there,
Kids who just needed
It's
to
like
hear this
actually right
answer
across
to
the street
TA,
from
not for
the
convictions, so that this you should have just not let
it
them
was disappointing.
be
It
able
was
to
kind
do
of
this. So
weird.
like it's basically
Got
10
here,
seconds,
went
and then
over
sort
there.
of thinking like, and
Dude, they were all just open.
you know, different evidences or different education next, and then we would
don't
have
call
which
it.
is like really frustrating, but totally fair.
So there was
I
like a
just
point in
missed
time where,
that.
okay, do we call him?
And I should have predicted that too, which is why,
Right,
like,
here's the thing. Whoever you're just gonna take me
That
from
seems to me
Madison,
like it
I'd
needs
rather
to
move to my
be
legs again.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead
It
of
was-
just there.
it was like, yeah, it was like,
You know, not worth the big.
That's a
deal.
judgment call.
exactly, so I like
Yeah.
understand, because I think it probably
Yeah.
was said, and I just.
I'm pretty like nervous about how now
Oh,
I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
So I just like drove back last night.
Yeah.
and came back this
Who was the
morning.
judge on
Yeah, James was like a great
James
judge.
there.
that? No, I mean,
Yeah.
Got to
she
see
can
my
do
cat,
it.
which I like to do because I see him every day.
I was just.
But I wanted to, that's how to
I mean, Ricky,
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go.
Yeah, and she was like,
I don't care. I don't like cat moms. I have many cat mom friends.
He's a Hector. He's 18. Well, he'll be 18 in
and
June.
she's like the readily say, I hear
me on Facebook.
He's not a baby, like, he doesn't actually hear about me, but I got him when I was
introducing this.
And so they want to.
Yeah, I'm sure, like,
This
if
is
he's
enough
that
for me to
old,
draw a
then
line
we're
between that.
even if
Those
he's
two
doing
things, that's basically what she's doing. I guess that is kind of what your general philosophy says.
That's my baby.
See if I can grab
I
Sam.
know, he's so spoiled.
Yeah, I'm like, if I have to.
See all the boys also.
Oh, yeah. His favorite toy is a,
Yeah,
that's that we
felt sled. It's really cute, and they also really like to have a little crochet monkey, they call it a little pet bed, which for like a monkey. Shit.
That's super cute.
Grocery stores.
No.
Okay, so they're doing like a dumb Monopoly piece thing, like, okay, so my mom was putting together Monopoly pieces, and then she comes back to,
Oh my god.
out of the entire family room, is like, no.
This is,
That's where it's gotta be.
that's always the way cats are. We have, Airbnb we're staying at, there's this, one of the owners has this little cat, and we have like something on the porch, there's just people over. And so we go out there, and this cat just like came up to us, and we're like, oh, hey, cat. And there's some food in this little thing, so like, obviously it's some food. And we was like, I'm not sure if we're supposed to continue, and it was like, I'm gonna open the door, and like, open the door 5 or 6 times. It was just so bad.
It's like a little thing.
Yeah, and it was like, there's nothing I can do. Yeah, it's really comfortable for dogs here.
It was just like, just all the just at my work there, it's all windows, and a lot of people walk out their dogs, so dog spotting is like my jam.
Fair enough. That's a good way to live life.
Because like the coffee shop can't bring dogs in, but you can really weird coffee shop is owned and next door to some people's food store.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like same name, like Trove, or something, Trove Coffee. Kind of coffee spot. It's pretty like, it's stop and I'm over there, so I always think the dog's walking by. I'm like, one lady, she brought her dog in to the coffee shop and she shouldn't have, but it was cute enough, it was on Sunday. It was cute enough to let us ride a 3-month-old Bernese Mountain dog. And his name was Bear. And that's what he looked like.
I just realized I messaged you.
He was so soft.
Yeah.
What?
What's funny is the first time I read it as exactly what you meant. I didn't notice it.
Right.
So we were like, alright, technically no, but can I bet
Said she wanted to give us some.
I actually named this company after my puppy.
Oh shit, what's the company?
Exodus Mouse. Exodus is a puppy.
Oh, what kind of puppy?
He's a pit bull boxer mix. And he also got part black lab in him. So he's yeah, me too. Especially with black labs. I had one as a kid, and so I don't know if it's like the black lab as a kid that maybe fall, but he's fine.
So Josie, because I just, oh my god, big clown eyes. And this is one baby.
Yeah, he's a big baby. Yeah.
How big is he when he's a dog?
Let me show you better picture. Here's like a full body leash.
I like the little white one checks.
Right?
Well, that's so good.
It's due on next Thursday.
Mhm.
Oh, I didn't realize that was happening, though.
He had like a little spot like that like when I was a kid. And also had a black lab at the same time that was like the same exact thing. It was
It's got like the feeling and a big white chest. Got a little mustache.
Two.
Yeah, in terms of like, so there's like, kind of like stature like this big, medium size, or like,
I'd say probably this whole one he's kind of pudgy because he likes to do a lot.
And that's my friend, she has a 6-month-old poodle puppy.
Oh, yeah.
And, she's my niece. Her name's Ellie, she turned 6 months on Tuesday. And she was like so, when she was first a puppy when I met her in November, when she was like 2 months old, she was like this big, she was so small. I'm talking about a dog.
Corn emoji. Corn react is the best react. On Slack. Do you like use Slack?
Yeah.
You know there's all the reactions.
Is that corn?
There's a corn
Why
reaction.
did you possibly need that?
Al inspired me. His love of corn in Iowa.
My favorite one is the cigarette one.
Yeah, I got no idea where you would do that.
The corn thing?
What's funny is that
There's a big list of GSU.
we track our viewers.
That's something that people might have grown a lot of corn in Iowa after the war.
During after the rains too.
I thought that was funny.
Is it puppy now?
Or wait, not. We're at 2 now. We're back down to 2. So I think that.
I just thought it was funny. You remember all of it.
Oh, okay, alright, cool. What can I say?
I guess that will be it.
I don't know. There's not so many that I don't remember all of them anymore.
No, God.
Y'all put in a military presence stock, right?
Huh?
You debate military presents?
I only did part of that time was like shoulder surgery. Yeah, so
One of my favorite things to do, that was when I was supposed to Sicily, my partner from when I lived in India.
I stayed in Ohio for like.
And we used to read the search counter. And there's like soft left teams or teams that were critical. Yeah, search the horn of Africa. And like a drones kind of, or landmine kind of plan, and drones kind of, we just read so much shit, and everybody was like, what?
Yeah, I'm a workout stuff there. We went for the terrorism gig and for terrorist stuff. That's a lot.
Is it 3 rounds?
That was a really good.
How does, what's something that is just the logistics side of it?
What color was that?
Well, we have this program, it's called
How long have y'all been in school?
It's like a broadcasting service. It's actually, I think
We're not really in school right now. We're technically enrolled in 12 credits.
But there's no other
one
reason
class a week.
survey, so, it works pretty well for us, and then we have this camera, and then
I applied to Wyoming,
$200 on these like student
MA
quality mics.
program.
But
This year?
we can't use them right
I'm just
now
waiting on the
because,
decision. I got into UNLV so
what
far.
we didn't
So
realize
I'm
is that,
just waiting to see.
all three computers that we have,
What do you wanna do?
there's audio ports.
Eventually
they
I'll
have
go on
one audio port
to
and
do
two.
PhD things. I'm probably teach. And,
Well, the cameras are good to be, and so
yeah,
like,
no, I'm
the problem is
rhetoric,
that we can't have
which
a
is why
adapter for the mic.
the
And
comm
so like,
program
we
at
figured this out like a
Wyoming
day,
seems a little
a
bit
day before
more
we
geared
did
towards
it.
interpersonal
So we were
comm.
like,
Actually, less so now.
Yeah, we lost her.
We've lost a ton of faculty. So we have 2 rhetoric scholars now, Graham, and then Dr. Patton. She's taking thematic this year. I think UNLV is part of one.
Right?
Well, I do, yeah, I think so too.
And it was
But
like,
I still feel.
well, then we were like, okay, so.
I like
so the-
I like the program.
Yeah, right.
Scared to take the size.
Right, and it was like,
It's a little bit bigger,
we
which is
did
why I
math, and
really
it was
like
like
the
only like
Wyoming program. It's
Yeah.
very small.
Yeah, no, that's tight knit. You a lot of time with
like
professors.
this.
But the goal I have for this master's program is just to polish as much as I can.
Yeah.
So that I can get into the PhD program, it feels like there'd be a lot more,
Oh, wow, where is it? And it
of
was
a
north
possibility
of
in a
the,
small program, with more fun interaction.
Totally.
the airport, so.
Yeah, I think our best bet is with T-Cram.
Yeah, I think so.
What,
It was
like,
called,
what interests you about
what was
rhetoric? What do you want to write on?
Blazers camera.
Or are you just kind of like, whatever?
That's such a
I
great
think that's
question.
just.
Yeah.
Because I jumped around a lot. So I've been a political science major, philosophy major, and now I'm a sociology major.
Yeah.
And philosophy
We were
minor.
really hoping to do
So
I think it like was in Seattle.
Questions of like systemic inequality,
That would make sense.
Yeah. Okay.
through a lens of like international politics. So I've
It was
like written on Okinawa and Brazilian constitution and fascist era, and like a bunch of different things that I think are very interesting.
Wow.
The goal is to narrow that.
Yeah, it's hard to do that though. It's like, I don't know. That's the cool part, but also the scary part about this one.
Yeah,
Is like, you can talk about anything.
Yeah.
Area of
So,
policy.
yeah. I know, T-Cram mostly does political comm stuff. I took his rhetorical theory, or like, it's just called Advanced Persuasion, a rhetoric class this year, and it was awesome. We read so much in that class, but mostly rhetoric. Who I thought I would be able to do that in here, but ended up being most of it.
Like you went from, thought I would like it, and then you thought
Oh, yeah. There was that. Let's look at this. Application I got.
That would be
You should pick life, Spencer.
I really like that. Even though it didn't do
anything that's telling you to choose life.
Interesting things. It's like a subtle, like pro-life campaign.
It's not so simple.
That's the nature of it, right? Yeah, it's pretty good. Is it David everywhere also? Nice. His voice is so soothing, right?
I think many of these lanes are factually incorrect.
For which app?
But, one related this one.
You gotta say for that.
I don't know where I got it. I was prepping.
The answer to this question.
Somebody else like might have to get some of ourselves so far back that it would take forever.
They had emailed us the app and then we're like, please delete that email. Because the 2A, I guess, is like his story and he just doesn't want it to be on the wiki and doesn't want other people to have it. So they made it up.
I've seen it before, it was like, it was annoying like a person. And
I just like it like that.
it was also considering like a person.
Going everywhere else.
It was like being like story behind like a ball.
Was it a prison
Yes, I
application?
feel like these were.
That wasn't the same thing, but we did that
I
yesterday.
think it was just like, it was like, I think it was like one of those things where it was like a weird choice that people made.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why we have like tons of.
Yeah, that's it. I meant when they accidentally sent it
I don't know, but then I don't think we'll just really
Yeah.
get into that. The problem is just basic real for it's so serious that, you know, if you don't really know
Yeah.
or if these are gonna lose, start up the debate some
I think
sloppy.
particularly the preference for schizophrenia being diagnosis, that's the part that I'm like, this
We
is.
just have it all, we have it all filed through the
I know.
transition section.
My phone's internet's not working.
Well,
The way up now.
Yeah, see, my laptop was not working at all. I'm just gonna keep it on.
Right? Mine's even on like,
Yeah, it's hitting the LCD, but it is not
Not
acting
enough
that
people
way.
that not enough people that too many concepts. Yeah, I think we want to go.
I was asking that in context too, I'm like, you're citing like
But not so far.
BS3. And like, there's two other versions of that now, and they're moving less towards a categorical diagnosis and more towards like a spectrum diagnosis, like, that seems to kind of result in people.
Or is it more having
Oh, yeah. No, see, here's the thing, it's not, so freezes are in Seattle, but those stereotypical Pacific Northwest cars are Subaru Outbacks. So many Subaru Outbacks, and at least
I mean, I knew we did.
60% of them will have some form of like the Washington with the heart bumper sticker, like the whole like Washington outlines for like the Columbia River border, just like it's scribbled code. There's like take me back to the Big REI stickers, take me to the mountains, like this version. So many
I've seen quite a few.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why you get a lot of them are.
Non-station, like non-station wagon, like station wagon, yes, like Subaru. Those seem to be also.
the impacts are.
Here, I'm gonna pull up, this is Bellingham, not Seattle, but, this is
all about.
Yeah.
this is an album that my partner made of like, okay, what's
Yeah, and I mean,
Let's try it.
Not because of.
Better.
oh, yeah, no, that implicates whether or not.
The collection of every single one, and he only takes pictures of the ones with too many bumper stickers. Okay, it's not loading, I give up. But, back on Sunday, we were driving to go skate, and we passed by this van, like, on us, big van. The entire back of the van and windshield was covered in, like, peace, love, coexist, like, Washington bumper stickers, and they started to, like, curve around the side of the van. We were like,
Yeah.
oh my god! How is this out the back? Like, it was like a wild thing to see. But yeah, bumper stickers, Subaru Outbacks are definitely.
I'm sure I've seen them, I just like know about them. It was weird to me, like, I've only seen like just one giant truck in my time being here, it's like that's all you see on campus. We were talking to our Uber driver on the way back from the airport, and he was like, yeah, it's just, like, I look down to have a truck in this area. That's weird, because like, Uganda is like, if you don't have a truck,
Hey.
what's wrong with you?
Look at you getting out there through
I don't know, that was intense, like why per truck?
I don't know,
Yeah, just
just because
they
it's
take
like,
all their cards and come and
it's
say.
like, it's one of those things, like, when you do, it's like a different topic, man. That's one thing, but like,
That's
everyone's
all
just
like
like,
their default
it's
template is
Scotland,
Comic Sans.
America, so we
Every
have to
room
drive
this
trucks.
year,
Yeah,
I was like
yeah,
upset by this, I got the
that's
couple
kind
of
of
Comic
the
Sans
vibe
bad
that
cards, we were
happens
just
here,
gonna pick out
because
that.
a lot of people who have trucks that drive them. And like, I mean, in the sense, like, my dad drives a truck, but he drives it, and like, he uses it to like, work, specifically work westy things, and go up in the mountains. But then there's like a bunch of people who drive trucks that are like, Eden Block, Hillsborough area, that's where they're coming from. Eden Block is one of the national news for that town is the reason that Washington had to make a
Yeah, that's
reality. Because that seems to be.
All right, Al, I have a random question for you.
That's one town.
As a judge, we wanted to go for a pick out of a
One
team's
of
font,
the sophomores
so
on the
they
debate
chose
team
the
my
font
freshman
Comic
year sent me
Sans.
that link, and I'm
So
like,
you
yeah,
put it
I
in
knew
any
that
other font
already. It
besides
was one
Comic
town under
Sans.
his margin.
You think the day is entitled
I'm like-
to font competition?
Yeah, it's like straight up local news. We're
Entitled to
But
nothing, I
it's
think.
definitely like they're not
Tentatively
eco-friendly, like they are
convinced me
not
that
efficient at all.
amongst
But,
all the other bad
also it's like,
arguments in
you're
debate,
just trying
there
to
are
get
worse
things out,
ones.
like, that's
There
the
are
worst part.
rednecks too.
A lot of the rednecks up here is
Alright.
What is the impact of Comic Sans got?
like.
I forget, there's like a deprofessionalization impact,
Oh my God.
there's like a, it's bad for people with dyslexia impact. I had like 4 cards that would work, so I was like, I'm so mad. And I wasn't debating, so I was just like, no, we better.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think they will.
Where the boots, where the.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mental
That
though.
That would be sad. You're
No,
the ways.
no, it does, but like there are other fonts.
I'm dreaming about.
It's cool, I'm just not judging you.
You can pick a font that like. is
Can't
also
make me, won't do
good
it.
for reading for people with dyslexia, as long as they're offense. Put it in Arial or something, I don't know what the fonts are.
For some reason, I just like comics are bad. Some newspaper comics.
Advocate newspapers, sans comics. Took you a while.
Okay. Not the best debate on the planet. A whole lot of sloppy on a lot of various pages. This was actually kind of difficult to evaluate because of so much sloppiness. I voted F. Okay, part of the biggest problem in this debate is really not answering the one argument that I actually thought that was their best argument in the 1ER under K, and that is you're wrong about the structure of colonialism. It's relations between people that ultimately determine what that structure is, and that devaluation is what produces colonialism, and that is essentially what produces indigenous erasure. I did feel like this was not answered in the 2NR, especially there was a moment in the 2NR where you said, and they have no impact defense whatsoever. And that clearly is really the only impact defense that they had. Part of the reason why this is so problematic for you is because of your role of the ballot argument.
Totally.
You know, I mean, if your role of the ballot argument was different, and even a little bit more self-serving, then it wouldn't be so simple for me to say that if they win this one argument, then they ultimately win the debate. Clearly, you have a bunch of link arguments that they haven't answered. You know, obviously moving clinics into different places, a supplement to medicalization, a dependency argument. I don't think that you're great necessarily at impacting each one of those link arguments, which you got to do if you think ultimately that they're gonna win one link turn. If I was doing, I think this is the right choice. I think this is definitely the right choice. I would go for this in the 2NR as opposed to T, and I can talk about some of the problems with the way that the T arguments went down. But you've got to know that they can't win the permutation. And part of the reason why they can't win the permutation is because it's incoherent at this point in time, especially after the 1AR. So your initial impulse that like, what is this? What does it look like? What does it do? What link arguments does it even avoid? None of that has ever been broached at all. So I don't think I'd spend as much time on the permutation as possible. I would really just use that as an opportunity to explain all the different link arguments. But given that your role of the ballot argument is the best team to combat oppressive power structures, if they're sort of right on what constitutes the power structure of colonialism, then they win via a descriptive argument alone in some ways. So I don't know if that necessarily helps you. I don't believe that the performative contradiction argument is a reason to vote against you at all. I struggled with this one for a long time. Okay, yeah, I can definitely see performative contradiction showing up as a response to the role of the ballot argument. But the problem is, in the 1AR, the way that you phrase all of these arguments doesn't make it seem as if it has anything to do with the role of the ballot. In fact, all of your arguments are, this is just a dissect T. That's all that it is. It's like, the way that you speak about these arguments has only, it is really only, it's not role of the ballot contradicts T. It is essentially this argument contradicts T. So there needs to be more, and I don't really even know why T implicitly is contradictory with this role of the ballot. You know, the team that best combats oppressive power structures, I mean, arguably, depending on what sort of arguments they make on T, having a debate about whether or not the act should provide health insurance is a way of combating oppressive power structures, because it's a way to at least combat a bunch of insurance corporations, and they are essentially part of, you know, the power structure that is operative within our understandings of health. I don't think that just because they're saying you got to be the federal government that means that they are power structures. But that's why in the 1AR the argument you're making is this contradicts T. Because, so I don't really think that it is a response to the role of the ballot. I also don't think that it helps you. The last thing that I sort of evaluated, well, let me just say one other thing with regard to this. The app is sort of barely right about, you know, what constitutes colonialism. Really, the way to answer this, and I don't think I would have had to think twice about it, is if Rifkin would have just been mentioned in the 2NR. And you know, Rifkin wasn't really discussed in a lot of detail. I mean, I do think that there is definitely a bunch of different things that you can say. And the last thing that I was essentially going to say is you do got to answer the app a little bit more in order to at least prevent the link turn from being true. I mean, your arguments seem correct. Mutual vulnerability obviously is not going to produce a recognition that we are ultimately responsible for, you know, the colonization of indigenous lands, especially in terms of land. And I think that there are so many other things that you can say. I mean, for starters, the only evidence they have in the 1AC that talks about an ethic of care says that an ethic of care is available to citizens, you know? And I think in the block, you know, when you sort of extend this is the kind of dominant structure of the world, I think you're a little too passive in it solves the app. It's just sort of like you're a better form of accountability. We are a form of accountability with regard to the app, making them accountable to larger structures. You do need a moment where it's more important for us to understand the world in terms of settler colonialism, and an explanation of what that means is either a structural foundation, it is an ontological foundation, it is more than that. If I was you, I would say it's an ontological foundation, and the reason I would is because you know that explanation is going to help you with the only potential of a link turn that they have. If indigenous life can't even be recognized ultimately as life, then mutual vulnerability won't see anything to be vulnerable to at all. I did think that a couple of the arguments on the case could have come back to haunt you in a way that would be devastating. I mean, in the 1AR, you've essentially just sort of extended the app, and you've said that an ethic of care is ultimately important to pay attention to things like social determinants, and just kind of assert that means that we would get corporations, they would be accountable, and we would essentially prevent environmental racism. You could have very easily stood up and said, this is the mutual vulnerability that we're talking about. The app is, if you believe in our ethic of care arguments, and they don't have any arguments that really answer the ethic, they just have arguments that answer care, the institutions of care, but not the way in which care is practiced. And that means that part of what happens when these medical institutions get set up is that the blame is put on U.S. corporations, and they are kicked out of indigenous territories. To me, that seems like a huge link turn. But I did think, starting from the 2AC, I thought you were a little behind on this argument in some ways. I think that you could be a lot more offensive. I mean, I think what I just said in the sense of, context is everything. The framing of the type of medical care ultimately determines what ultimately it becomes, needs to be made more explicit. So then reading evidence that just says, medicine likes to set up clinics and they like to ultimately pretend as if they're taking care of indigenous populations, and that's just a way of making colonialism more palatable. You need a more coherent argument, not us. The ethic of care anchors whatever extension of medicine shows up on Indian country, and that has the potential, obviously, to both fight back a biomedical model and to draw an attention to that colonialism is attempting to try to sort of demonstrate its benevolence. I don't think you're really all that good at saying you got to answer the ethic in order to have a real link. These are all arguments about the status quo. And I also think that the other thing, if I was doing this 2AR, I would try to have a different impact to the app besides just ethical subjectivity. I mean, the app is a certain type of ethical subjectivity that at least attempts to break down one of the ways that neoliberalism functions, and it justifies itself by believing that the world is a bunch of scarce resources and rationing needs to occur, and having an impact to neoliberalism potentially. Maybe explaining that is somehow related to your military intervention argument. The military intervention argument as the impact of the app is a little curious to me. Like, what I kind of think of with regard to this app is that part of what you do as the debate goes on, you talk about things like social determinants, you talk about economic devaluation having an impact in and of itself. Those seem like the real impacts to me, as opposed to this particular notion of care is what justifies us going abroad. I mean, mutual vulnerability, obviously, and human security, and these are arguments that you don't even need cards that say this, but it's like human security, colonialism. Obviously, there are tons of cards. The idea that we need to sort of pay attention to the vulnerability of populations that are being taken advantage of was the justification in some ways for both Iraq and Afghanistan. There are women in Afghanistan that need saving. There's a vulnerability that we need protecting. That this is not a realist form of intervention. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It is one that pays attention to not geopolitical security, but human security. It seems so easy to win. This app doesn't solve the one impact that it has, and arguably aggravates it in a larger way. So I could probably be convinced that the app makes things worse for what it is that they try to solve. But with regard to this debate, they got a better explanation of oppressive power structures, and that seems to be the way in which we should decide the debate. And last thing that I would say in the 2AR, you should not agree to that argument. I feel like that your arguments with regard to role of the ballot are only trying to make it seem inconsistent with key, but there's not an argument that, this is either unfair, this eliminates a huge portion of the app, you don't really know what that means. How do you evaluate that? Do you evaluate that by, imagining things through fiat, or what's the route to challenging those oppressive power structures? I also feel like that it could be so much better, sorry to just keep going on, but part of what the 2AC does is sort of emphasize values are more important for nudging health policy or health understanding along. There is so much stuff that is so great on that I feel like needs to be read, whether it's just the people that believe in, the phrase critical health praxis, or, there's a book called Social Construction of Illness by Peter Conrad that makes these arguments that say that as soon as you talk policy to people with regard to healthcare, they tune out, only by sort of talking about what do you think that it means that as a society that people don't have access to care. It's that discussion which motivates people. And to me, I clearly want to make those arguments in the 2AC because it helps answer some of the case arguments. Like the Ford evidence basically says that really what we need is mass participation. It describes community health as just a form of self-help, and the only thing that's going to change health politics is if we get the masses involved. And if I was you, I'd say only we do by focusing on values, You don't. Your policy speak obviously causes the public to tune out. This is a DA to both of your interpretations of the topic. Okay, with regard to T, you could have won this easily, in my opinion. All you got to do is really demonstrate that an ethic of care, there are so many different variants of it that it ultimately is impossible to debate. And the second thing that you have to do is just be better on ground. It's like the only thing that you've listed is we want to be able to say insurance bad. Really what I would do before this debate is I would try to come up with a different advocacy that's a different ethic of care, wait for them to permute it or to say it's no different from us, and use that as kind of the proof of your abuse. We want to debate the ethic of care, and we can't because you've described it in such nebulous ways that ultimately nothing that we say would potentially be competitive. When ethic of care is close enough to the direction of the topic, that allows all these sort of arguments that prevents the discussion of what their app is about, which is the only way for their value, I feel like that word NLD, to have meaning. So it's the only way to essentially not just correct the app, but to sort of to examine what a communal ethic of care ultimately means. And there's so many other things that you could say against this app. Community, really, who gets to speak for the community? What is the community? Robinson says that it's only citizens. You know, who gets to be part of these communities? Why do we believe that communities are somehow immune from the neoliberal logic that somehow exists within the government? Why wouldn't communities also put value on people's lives and say, if you're sick, this is how much money you get? Yeah, they may be focused on other things. I mean, the app is so removed from any historical analogs of what communal care looks like. And there are examples. You know, the Black Panthers obviously set up clinics, and they did a lot of things that it seems like what you think that your app does by turning clinics into a space to kind of get people to pay attention to their job, their landlords, you know, environmental racism in their communities. So they used it as both, you know, a biomedical opportunity to provide people care, and the Black Panthers believed that the federal government had a responsibility to provide free care for oppressed people, which is what the TDA should be. You know, it's like the DA that just puts value on people's lives, not in the same way that capitalism does. You know, it's possible to make arguments that says that form of valuation is a form of respect. The safety net element of it prevents that calculation from writing people out. You know, and especially if your TDA, the government pays for community health care, you don't have to really believe in necessarily insurance. Whatever you want gets paid for. That could be a social health issue, that could be a biomedical issue. To me, that version of the app is easier to debate because as the government obviously instigates something, it talks about ethics of care, it talks about communities, it's rooted in historical lived experience. To me, that would be a good debate to witness. And yeah, you may not, you have the economy DA, I guess. Oh, last thing I should say is, I also thought the 2AR could have gone for the criticisms of the economy DA. And the only reason is because just the way that you waffled in the 2R, you're basically just like not going for it, and then you said the phrase, but it is a real thing. I mean, it does happen. Was the phrase like, what? So what are you doing? That was a confusing moment, and then there was also confusion in the 2R just on the key page about whether or not you were even going for the alternative or not. Like there was a moment where it's just like the alt solves, not really an explanation besides just a better form of subjectivity or ethical accountability, and then there's we don't need it. But there were times when it sort of seemed like I don't really know. Is the alt ultimately a better form of accountability? Is it better with regard to your role of the ballot? It seems like you're trying to solve the app. And you should obviously make two arguments. We solve the app and we're better for what we described as a fair debate to have, how to contest oppressive power structures. You know? And you shouldn't be like, we don't need it. You should clearly have it. I mean, it's like, does the 1AR really have a developed argument as to why the alt doesn't solve? No! Okay, so let's not waffle on that and think that we don't need it. Yeah, you need it. Of course you need it. It can only help. Yeah. All right. Questions?
I just have one. I think I know the answer, but sort of like, if the 2NR is a problem of impacting link arguments, not so much in terms of like causal problems, but relative to the role of the ballot, so that, because it seemed to me kind of like vulnerability stuff might solve some of our internal links, but it wouldn't resolve like the disavowing scarcity causes extinction kind of internal link, because it doesn't filter through settler colonialism. Am I right that it's just like a problem of we haven't explained why that matters for your ballot?
Though I do obviously believe that the link arguments need a more specific impact. Clearly, the link argument that it doesn't solve is the dependency argument, you know? And so explaining why that's sort of more important to settler colonialism than vulnerability, you know? This is the gift, the myth of settlers to act as if they are ultimately responsible, and to just make an argument about indigenous self-reliance as ultimately being more important than really trying to believe in the fantasy that the settler is going to essentially change their stripes, you know? So that's the argument that I thought for sure, obviously, this supposed link term would answer, but the larger problem is not winning that your structure of power is correct.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
That's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
And that it's not the structure that determines things, it's that relationships determine the structure. You know, and if they win the devaluation is what produces settler colonialism, and the act is a way of addressing that, then you're wrong about your role in the ballot being best for combating oppressive structures.
Okay.
That's the most important thing. It's just easily resolved just by sort of explaining what Ricky meant, you know, and explaining that it's too easy to say that. And the other thing that you should say is like, look, we understand that this is their goal, that they think that they're a production of mutual vulnerability, but if they're right that vulnerability determines settler colonialism, we win a link argument that says that vulnerability basically just hides a new manifestation of power relations between the settler and the settled, then they don't solve vulnerability, they create it. Which creates the structure, so even in their little world, you know, that it's the power structure is inverted, it's created by relationships between individuals. If we went on link arguments, it still turns out.
Yeah.
But you gotta say.
Yeah.
Because I did struggle with that quite a bit, you know, like, there's definitely a bunch of link arguments. You should not go for the permutation either in the 2AR, obviously, because it's like never earlier in the debate has it really been explained as like what link arguments it avoids. And especially for me, like, if you can't name all the different link arguments and prove how the permutation avoids those or solves some of them back, it's a non-starter. Like, I'm not going to really do that work for you at all. And in the 2AR, you were just sort of like, it's not even really a permutation, it's just no link argument. No link argument to which of the link arguments? Does it answer the medical clinics move in? Does it answer the dependency argument? Does it answer the app supplements medicalization? So it doesn't help you at all. In fact, it only hurts you by sort of making it seem as if you're not aware of what's important. You know? Does that make sense?